In the summer of 1944, as the Allied armies pushed deeper into occupied France following the landings in Normandy, one of the most decisive battles of the Western Front, unfolded across the fields and narrow roads surrounding a small town called Falaise. The German army, once considered one of the most powerful military forces in Europe, suddenly found itself trapped. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, and retreating soldiers were funneling through corridor in a desperate attempt to escape the encirclement created by advancing Allied forces. What followed over the next 72 hours would become one of the most devastating air assaults of the war. Above the battlefield, squadrons of British Hawker, Typhoon fighter bombers began to appear again and again in the skies, flying low over the French countryside. Armed with powerful rockets and cannons, these aircraft were designed specifically for attacking ground targets, and in the chaos of the Falaise Pocket they found exactly the kind of targets they had been built to destroy. In this documentary, we will explore how British Typhoons hunted German convoys from the skies, how the desperate escape through the Falaise corridor turned into a deadly trap, and how 72 hours of relentless air attacks helped destroy hundreds of German vehicles and collapse the final German resistance in Normandy. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In and Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The situation in Normandy after the breakout. By August of 1944, the Allied campaign in Normandy had entered a critical new phase. The landings on the beaches 2 months earlier had secured a foothold in occupied France, but the fighting that followed had been slow and difficult. The landscape of Normandy was filled with hedgerows, narrow lanes, and thick fields bordered by dense vegetation. These hedgerows, known locally as bocage, created natural defensive barriers that favored the German defenders. Allied infantry and armored units often found themselves advancing only a few hundred meters at a time, facing well-prepared German positions hidden behind the thick banks of earth and vegetation. For weeks after D-Day, the battle had settled into a grinding struggle where progress was measured in small gains and heavy losses. Yet by late July, the situation began to change dramatically. The Allies launched a major offensive known as Operation Cobra, designed to break through the German defensive lines near the town of St. Lo. Massive aerial bombardment struck German positions, weakening their defenses and creating openings for American forces to push forward. Once the breakthrough occurred, the character of the war in Normandy changed almost overnight. What had been a slow and methodical campaign suddenly became a rapid movement of armies across the French countryside. American armored divisions surged through the weakened German lines, advancing deep into the interior of France. The German command structure, already strained by weeks of intense fighting, now faced a rapidly deteriorating situation. German units that had been holding defensive positions in Normandy suddenly found themselves at risk of being cut off. As Allied forces pushed south and east, the possibility emerged that large portions of the German army could be surrounded. Within the German high command, confusion and disagreement grew about how to respond. Some commanders argued that the army should withdraw eastward to avoid encirclement. Others insisted that counterattacks should be launched to push the Allies back and restore the front line. These conflicting strategies delayed decisive action, and valuable time was lost while Allied forces continued to advance. Meanwhile, the Allied command recognized the opportunity unfolding before them. If their armies could move quickly enough, they might trap a large portion of the German forces in Normandy. The plan that began to form was simple in concept but difficult in execution. Allied armies would push from multiple directions, closing a gap around the German troops still fighting in the region. If successful, this maneuver would create a massive pocket in which thousands of German soldiers, along with their vehicles and equipment, would be trapped with no clear route of escape. The town of Falaise soon became a key point in this developing strategy. Located southeast of Caen, Falaise sat near the center of the area where German forces were beginning to concentrate during their withdrawal. Roads from across Normandy converged in this region, making it an important crossroads for any army attempting to move eastward. As German units began retreating toward this area, the possibility of encirclement became increasingly real. For soldiers on both sides, the pace of events accelerated rapidly. Units that had spent weeks fighting in static defensive positions suddenly found themselves moving across open countryside, attempting to outmaneuver their opponents. German columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery began shifting eastward along crowded roads as commanders attempted to reorganize their forces and avoid being surrounded. Yet the very movement that offered hope of escape also created vulnerability. Long convoys of vehicles moving along narrow roads became visible targets from the air. Allied reconnaissance aircraft constantly monitored these movements, reporting the locations of German units to commanders on the ground and in the air. It was during this chaotic phase of the campaign that one particular Allied weapon would begin to play a decisive role in the unfolding battle: the British Hawker Typhoon fighter bomber. The Hawker Typhoon had originally been developed as a fighter aircraft, but over time it had proven especially effective in a different role. Its powerful engine and strong airframe allowed it to carry heavy weapons designed for attacking ground targets. By 1944, the Typhoon had become one of the most important close-support aircraft used by Allied forces in Western Europe. Equipped with rockets and cannons capable of destroying armored vehicles, the Typhoon was perfectly suited for striking enemy convoys, tanks, and supply columns. As the German army began retreating through the Normandy countryside, these aircraft would soon find an abundance of targets. Allied air forces had already established strong control over the skies above Normandy. German aircraft appeared only rarely, and Allied pilots operated with relative freedom across the battlefield. This air superiority meant that reconnaissance flights could constantly observe the movement of German forces. Whenever large concentrations of vehicles were detected, fighter bombers could be directed to attack them. In the open terrain beyond the hedgerows, retreating columns of trucks and tanks were highly visible from above. The developing situation around Falaise soon attracted the attention of Allied commanders. Intelligence reports indicated that large numbers of German units were attempting to move eastward through the narrowing corridor between advancing Allied forces. If these troops managed to escape, they could reorganize and continue fighting deeper inside France. But if the corridor could be closed quickly enough, a large portion of the German army might be trapped. Allied ground forces moved toward the area from multiple directions in an attempt to seal the gap. Canadian and Polish units advanced from the north, while American forces pushed from the south. As these armies moved closer together, the escape route available to the German forces grew narrower with each passing day. The roads leading out of the developing pocket became increasingly crowded. German commanders ordered thousands of vehicles to move through the corridor in a desperate attempt to withdraw their forces before the trap closed completely. Tanks, trucks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and horse-drawn wagons all joined the retreat. Soldiers moved alongside the vehicles, some on foot and others riding atop the crowded transports. The result was a massive and chaotic traffic jam stretching across miles of countryside. From the air, the scene was unmistakable. Reconnaissance pilots reported long columns of vehicles moving along narrow roads bordered by fields and small villages. These columns were often packed tightly together, making it difficult for individual vehicles to maneuver or disperse. For the pilots of Allied fighter bombers, such formations represented ideal targets. The Typhoon squadrons operating in the region began receiving increasing numbers of missions directing them toward these German convoys. Pilots who had trained extensively in ground attack tactics now found themselves flying into one of the most target-rich environments of the entire war in Western Europe. The stage was set for what would become one of the most destructive air assaults against ground forces during the Normandy campaign. Over the next 72 hours, the skies above the Falaise Pocket would be filled with the roar of Typhoon engines as waves of aircraft descended upon the trapped German columns below. The battle was about to enter its most devastating phase. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The road to Falaise, Germany's retreat begins. As the Allied breakthrough from Normandy gained momentum in early August 1944, the German army faced a rapidly worsening situation. For weeks, German divisions had fought fiercely to hold their defensive positions against the Allied forces that had landed on the Normandy beaches in June. Many of these units had already suffered heavy casualties during the earlier phases of the campaign. Tanks had been lost, vehicles destroyed, and entire battalions reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Yet despite these losses, the German command still hoped that the front line could somehow be stabilized. What they did not fully anticipate was how quickly the Allied advance would begin to unravel their defensive system once Operation Cobra succeeded. When American forces broke through the German lines near St. Lo, the entire strategic balance in Normandy shifted almost overnight. Instead of fighting a slow defensive battle behind hedgerow-sand-prepared positions, German units suddenly faced a fast-moving enemy advancing across open terrain. American armored divisions began driving deep into the French countryside, bypassing many of the strong points that had previously slowed the Allied advance. Roads that had once carried supplies to the front now filled with German vehicles moving in the opposite direction as commanders attempted to reposition their forces. The German high command struggled to determine how best to respond. Some officers believed that an immediate withdrawal toward the east was necessary in order to preserve what remained of their forces. Others insisted that counterattacks could still push the Allies back and restore the defensive line in Normandy. Adolf Hitler himself ordered several attempts at counteroffensives, including a major attack near the town of Mordain. German armored divisions were sent forward in an effort to cut through the advancing American units and re-establish control of the situation. However, these counterattacks quickly ran into overwhelming resistance. Allied ground forces had already established strong positions, and the skies above Normandy were dominated by Allied aircraft that constantly monitored German movements. Whenever German armored columns attempted to advance, they were often spotted from the air and attacked before they could reach their objectives. The Mordain counterattack ultimately failed, and its failure made the German situation even more dangerous. By committing valuable armored divisions to the attack, the German command had weakened its ability to withdraw in an organized manner. Instead of creating a new defensive line, the failed offensive left large German formations exposed to the advancing Allied armies. As American forces continued pushing eastward and Canadian and British troops advanced from the north, the possibility of encirclement became increasingly real. The geography of the region began to shape the battle in ways that neither side could ignore. The roads and towns of Normandy formed natural corridors through which armies had to move. One of the most important of these areas lay near the town of Falaise. Situated in the rolling countryside southeast of Cannes, Falaise was surrounded by a network of roads that connected multiple regions of Normandy. For German units attempting to retreat from the advancing Allied forces, these roads represented one of the few possible routes of escape. As German commanders realized the danger of encirclement, orders began to spread through the ranks directing units to withdraw toward the east. What followed was not a single organized retreat but a massive and chaotic movement of troops, vehicles, and equipment across the countryside. Entire divisions attempted to move simultaneously along the same limited network of roads. Tanks, armored vehicles, supply trucks, artillery pieces, and fuel transports all joined the growing stream of traffic heading toward the narrowing gap between the advancing Allied forces. Soldiers marched alongside the vehicles, some riding on the backs of trucks while others moved on foot carrying what equipment they could. The roads quickly became crowded with columns stretching for miles. For the German soldiers involved, the retreat was filled with uncertainty. Many units had lost contact with their higher headquarters, and communication between divisions became increasingly difficult as the situation deteriorated. Some commanders attempted to maintain order by organizing their columns carefully and ensuring that vehicles moved steadily toward the escape routes. Others found themselves caught in traffic jams where vehicles could move only slowly or not at all. Broken-down trucks and damaged tanks sometimes blocked entire sections of road, forcing drivers to wait while crews attempted repairs or pushed disabled vehicles aside. Meanwhile, the Allied forces pressing inward from multiple directions began to recognize the opportunity developing before them. Canadian and Polish units advanced southward toward Falaise while American forces continued their movement north and east. The goal was clear: close the gap before the German army could escape. Every mile gained by the Allied ground forces reduced the space available for the German retreat. The narrowing corridor soon became known as the Falaise Pocket. Within this pocket, tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves caught between converging Allied armies. Yet despite the growing danger, the retreat continued. German columns pressed forward along the remaining roads, hoping to reach safety before the trap closed completely. The scene unfolding across the countryside was one of confusion and urgency. Fields and villages that had previously seen quiet rural life were suddenly filled with the sounds of engines, artillery, and marching troops. Smoke from burning vehicles drifted across the roads as damaged equipment was abandoned or destroyed. German soldiers attempted to keep moving despite the chaos around them, knowing that every delay increased the risk of being trapped inside the pocket. Above this unfolding drama, Allied aircraft continued to patrol the skies. Reconnaissance pilots reported the growing concentration of German vehicles moving toward the Falaise corridor. From the air, the retreating columns were clearly visible. Long lines of trucks and tanks moved slowly along narrow roads bordered by fields and hedgerows. For Allied commanders, these reports confirmed that the German army was attempting a large-scale withdrawal through a limited area. And for the pilots of the British Hawker Typhoon squadrons preparing for their missions, the reports signaled something else entirely: the coming opportunity strike, one of the largest concentrations of enemy vehicles seen during the entire Normandy campaign. Chapter 1, Segment 3. A target-rich battlefield, German columns on the move. By the middle of August 1944, the situation across the Normandy battlefield had transformed into something neither side had fully anticipated when the campaign began weeks earlier. What had once been a slow struggle through hedgerows and fortified villages had suddenly become a race across open countryside. Allied armored divisions were advancing quickly, pushing German forces back toward a shrinking corridor around the towns of Falaise, Trun, and Chambois. Within this narrowing space, thousands of German soldiers and an enormous number of vehicles attempted to escape before the Allied armies could close the gap entirely. The retreat created one of the most chaotic scenes of the entire Normandy campaign. Roads that had once been quiet rural routes now carried endless streams of military traffic. German tanks rumbled forward alongside armored half-tracks, trucks loaded with ammunition, fuel transports, artillery tractors, and supply vehicles of every description. Horse-drawn wagons also appeared among the columns, reflecting the fact that many German units still relied on horses to move equipment and supplies. Infantry soldiers marched along the edges of the roads, some riding on vehicles while others walked in exhausted formations beside them. The sheer scale of movement created an enormous logistical challenge. Vehicles often became trapped in long lines that stretched for miles, waiting for the road ahead to clear. Broken-down trucks or damaged tanks sometimes blocked entire sections off-road, forcing other vehicles to slow down or detour across nearby fields. German mechanics worked desperately to repair engines and keep vehicles moving, knowing that any delay could prove disastrous if Allied forces reached the area before they escaped. For many German soldiers, the retreat felt like a race against time. Reports circulated through the ranks that Allied forces were closing in from multiple directions. American units were advancing from the south, while Canadian and Polish forces pushed from the north. If these armies succeeded in linking up, the corridor would close completely and trap everyone still inside the pocket. Despite the urgency, the retreat remained disorganized in many places. Communication between units had become difficult, and many formations had lost contact with their higher command. Officers struggled to direct traffic along the crowded roads while trying to maintain some level of order within their units. Meanwhile, the landscape of Normandy played a crucial role in shaping the retreat. Although the region was known for its dense hedgerows, the terrain around the Falaise corridor contained more open areas and rolling farmland. These open spaces made it easier for large columns of vehicles to move, but they also made those columns far more visible from above. This visibility would soon become a critical factor in the battle. Allied reconnaissance aircraft had been flying constant patrols over the region, carefully observing the movements of German forces. Pilots reported seeing enormous concentrations of vehicles attempting to move through the corridor. From the air, the scene was unmistakable. Long lines of trucks, tanks, and artillery stretching along narrow roads that wound through fields and villages. For Allied commanders, these reports confirmed that the German army was attempting a massive withdrawal. For the Allied air forces, the reports revealed something equally important. The retreating columns presented ideal targets for ground attack aircraft. Among the aircraft preparing to exploit this opportunity were the British Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers. By this stage of the war, the Typhoon had proven itself to be one of the most effective ground attack aircraft in the Allied arsenal. Originally designed as a fighter, the aircraft had evolved into a specialized weapon for destroying targets on the ground. Its powerful engine allowed it to fly at high speed at low altitude, making it ideal for striking enemy vehicles and then escaping before ground defenses could react. The Typhoon carried an impressive array of weapons for these missions. Under its wings were mounted powerful rockets capable of penetrating the armor of tanks and armored vehicles. In addition to the rockets, the aircraft was equipped with 4 20mm cannons that could fire devastating bursts of ammunition into trucks, artillery positions, or other soft targets. This combination of speed, firepower, and maneuverability made the Typhoon particularly feared by enemy troops on the ground. As intelligence reports about the German retreat began to accumulate, Allied commanders recognized that the Falaise corridor offered an extraordinary opportunity for air attack. Thousands of German vehicles were attempting to move through a relatively small area, often packed closely together along narrow roads. If these columns could be struck repeatedly from the air, the retreat could quickly turn into chaos. Destroyed vehicles would block the roads, trapping other units behind them and preventing the German army from escaping the pocket. Typhoon squadrons stationed at airfields in southern England and newly captured bases in France soon began receiving orders for increased operations over the Falaise region. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms where intelligence officers explained the situation unfolding on the ground. Maps were spread across tables showing the roads used by German forces as they attempted to withdraw eastward. Reconnaissance photographs revealed the growing concentrations of vehicles along these routes. The pilots understood immediately what this meant. The battlefield they were about to enter contained more targets than any previous mission many of them had flown. Yet the missions would not be simple. German forces were still capable of defending themselves with anti-aircraft weapons mounted on trucks and armored vehicles. These guns could fire rapidly at low-flying aircraft, creating a dangerous environment for Typhoon pilots who often attacked from extremely low altitude. Flying directly toward columns of vehicles while firing rockets and cannons required both skill and nerve. Even so, the pilots were confident in the abilities of their aircraft and the tactics they had developed through months of experience supporting ground forces. As the days of mid-August approached, the skies above the Falaise Pocket prepared to witness one of the most intense ground attack operations of the entire Normandy campaign. Below, the German columns continued their desperate attempt to escape through the narrowing corridor. Above, the Typhoon squadrons were preparing to strike. Within the next 72 hours, the roads leading out of the pocket would become a battlefield unlike any seen earlier in the campaign, a place where the retreating army would face relentless attack from the skies. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The Hawker Typhoon, Britain's ground attack weapon. Long before the dramatic events at the Falaise Pocket unfolded in August 1944, the aircraft that would play such a decisive role in the battle had already undergone a remarkable transformation. The Hawker Typhoon was not originally designed to become one of the most feared ground attack aircraft of the Second World War. In fact, when the aircraft was first developed in the early years of the war, its intended role was that of a high-speed interceptor fighter. The British Royal Air Force needed aircraft capable of confronting fast German fighters and bombers, and engineer-sat Hawker aircraft set out to design a machine powerful enough to meet that challenge. The Typhoon emerged from this effort as a robust aircraft powered by one of the most powerful engines available at the time, the Napier Sabre. This engine was a complex and innovative design that produced enormous horsepower, giving the Typhoon exceptional speed at low altitude. However, the aircraft's early operational history proved challenging. In its initial role as a high-altitude interceptor, the Typhoon struggled against German fighters that performed better at higher altitudes. Mechanical issues with the engine and airframe also caused difficulties during the early stages of its service. For a time, it seemed uncertain whether the Typhoon would become a successful aircraft at all. Yet the Royal Air Force soon discovered that the Typhoon possessed qualities that made it uniquely suited to a different mission entirely. Although it struggled at high altitudes, the aircraft performed exceptionally well at low levels, where its powerful engine and sturdy construction allowed it to fly fast and maneuver aggressively close to the ground. These characteristics made the Typhoon ideal for attacking targets on the battlefield. As the war progressed and Allied forces prepared for large-scale operations in Western Europe, the need for effective ground attack aircraft became increasingly clear. Armored vehicles, supply convoys, artillery positions, and troop concentrations all presented targets that could be struck from the air to support advancing ground forces. The Typhoon proved capable of fulfilling this role with remarkable effectiveness. Engineers began adapting the aircraft specifically for ground attack missions. The Typhoon's strong wings allowed it to carry heavy weapon loads that other fighter aircraft could not support as easily. In addition to its 4 powerful 20mm cannons mounted in the wings, the aircraft was soon equipped with rockets designed to destroy armored vehicles and fortified positions. These rockets were mounted beneath the wings in groups, giving the Typhoon the ability to fire devastating salvos against ground targets. For Allied ground troops, the presence of Typhoon squadrons soon became a symbol of powerful air support. When soldiers heard the distinctive roar of Typhoon engines approaching the battlefield, they knew that help from the air had arrived. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Typhoon had become one of the most important aircraft in the Allied arsenal for close air support. Squadrons of Typhoons were stationed at airfields in southern England, ready to cross the English Channel and attack German forces whenever ground commanders requested assistance. Their missions often involved flying low over the battlefield in search of enemy tanks, vehicles, artillery, and troop formations. Pilots trained extensively in these tactics, learning how to approach targets quickly, fire their weapons accurately, and escape before enemy anti-aircraft fire could react. The rockets carried by Typhoon were particularly effective against armored vehicles. Each rocket carried a powerful warhead capable of penetrating the armor of German tanks when it struck directly. Although hitting a moving tank from the air required skill and precision, experienced Typhoon pilots developed techniques that allowed them to deliver devastating attacks against armored columns. When multiple aircraft attacked the same target area in succession, the effect could be overwhelming for troops on the ground. In addition to rockets, the Typhoon's 4 cannons could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. These weapons were especially effective against softer targets such as trucks, supply vehicles, and infantry positions. Even heavily armored vehicles could be damaged if the cannons struck vulnerable areas such as engines or exposed equipment. The combination of rockets and cannons gave Typhoon pilots a wide range of options when attacking enemy forces. The aircraft's speed and low-altitude performance also contributed to its effectiveness. Typhoon pilots often approached their targets at very low levels, using the terrain to remain hidden until the last possible moment. This tactic reduced the time enemy forces had to act or take cover. Once the pilots reached their attack point, they climbed slightly to line up their weapons before diving toward the target. Rockets were fired in rapid bursts, followed by cannon fire as the aircraft swept past the enemy positions. After completing the attack, the Typhoons pulled away quickly, often circling to prepare for another strike. For German troops on the ground, the arrival of Typhoon aircraft could be terrifying. The sudden roar of engines followed by explosions from rockets and cannon fire created chaos among vehicle columns and defensive positions. Soldiers often attempted to scatter or hide their vehicles under trees or camouflage nets, but these measures were not always effective when aircraft attacked repeatedly throughout the day. By the summer of 1944, Typhoon squadrons had become an essential part of the Allied strategy in Western Europe. Their ability to strike quickly and destroy enemy vehicles helped slow German movements and disrupt attempts to reinforce or retreat from the battlefield. As the Allied armies advanced across Normandy in August 1944, the Typhoon pilots found themselves preparing for what would become one of their most significant missions. The retreating German columns heading toward the Falaise corridor presented an extraordinary concentration of targets. Roads crowded with tanks, trucks, and artillery offered the kind of battlefield conditions where the Typhoon's weapons could have devastating results. In the days ahead, these aircraft would prove just how powerful close air support could be when applied against a trapped army trying desperately to escape. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Preparing the Strike. Allied air power mobilizes. As the German armies in Normandy struggled to escape the tightening trap around the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, Allied commanders recognized that the moment had arrived to use one of their greatest advantages: overwhelming air power. For weeks, Allied aircraft had dominated the skies above northern France. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force in Western Europe, had been severely weakened by years of combat and constant losses. Fuel shortages, damaged airfields, and the destruction of many experienced German pilots had reduced its ability to challenge Allied air operations. As a result, British, American, and Canadian aircraft could operate over the battlefield with far greater freedom than earlier in the war. This air superiority created an opportunity that Allied commanders were determined to exploit. Intelligence reports from reconnaissance flights revealed that enormous numbers of German vehicles were attempting to move through the narrow corridor east of Falaise. Columns stretched along the roads for miles, sometimes packed so tightly that vehicles could barely move forward. These conditions created what military planners described as a target-rich environment. For pilots flying ground attack missions, such concentrations of vehicles meant that even a single attack could cause significant disruption. If enough vehicles were destroyed or disabled along the roads, the entire retreat could collapse into chaos. Allied air commanders quickly began organizing a large-scale effort to strike these retreating German forces. Among the most important aircraft assigned to this mission were the Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers of the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Force. These squadrons had spent months training for precisely this kind of operation, attacking enemy vehicles, artillery, and supply columns in direct support of ground troops. Now they would be to carry out some of the most intense ground attack missions of the entire war. At airfields across southern England and newly captured bases in Normandy, Typhoon squadrons prepared their aircraft for repeated sorties over the battlefield. Ground crews worked tirelessly to keep the planes ready for flight. Rockets were carefully mounted beneath the wings. Each one secured in-launch rails that would allow the pilot to fire them during the attack. Ammunition belts were loaded into the aircraft's 4 powerful cannons. Fuel tanks were filled, engines inspected, and control systems checked repeatedly to ensure that the aircraft could operate safely under the demanding conditions of combat missions. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms where intelligence officers explained the situation unfolding around the Falaise Pocket. Large maps were pinned to the walls, showing the roads that German forces were using in their attempt to escape. Reconnaissance photographs taken by Allied aircraft revealed the scale of the retreat. Long lines of trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, and supply wagons filled the narrow routes leading eastward. In some images, the vehicles appeared so closely packed that they formed nearly continuous lines along the roads. These photographs made it clear that the German army was attempting to withdraw enormous quantities of equipment and personnel before the Allied ground forces could close the pocket entirely. The mission plans were straightforward in concept but dangerous in execution. Typhoon pilots would fly low across the Normandy countryside, searching for German columns along the designated routes. Once a column was located, the aircraft would attack using rockets and cannon fire before climbing away and preparing for another pass. Often several aircraft attacked the same area in succession, creating repeated strikes against the same targets. This tactic increased the likelihood that vehicles would be destroyed and roads blocked, preventing other units from escaping the corridor. Flying these missions required tremendous concentration and skill. Typhoon pilots typically approached their targets at low altitude to avoid being detected too early. Flying close to the ground allowed them to use terrain features such as hills, trees, and buildings as cover. When they reached the attack point, they climbed slightly and lined up their aircraft with the column of vehicles below. Rockets were then fired in quick succession, followed by bursts from the aircraft's cannons as the pilots swept over the target area. Although the Typhoon was a powerful aircraft, these attacks exposed the pilots to significant danger. German forces moving through the corridor still possessed anti-aircraft weapons capable of firing rapidly at low-flying aircraft. Many vehicles carried mounted guns designed specifically to defend against air attacks as Typhoons approached their targets. These weapons often opened fire, filling the air with streams of tracer rounds. Pilots had to remain focused on their attack while maneuvering to avoid being hit. Despite these risks, the Typhoon squadrons were confident in their ability to carry out the mission. The aircraft's speed and maneuverability gave them an advantage when escaping after an attack, and the pilots had gained extensive experience flying similar missions earlier in the Normandy campaign. What made the situation around the Falaise Pocket particularly significant was the sheer scale of the German retreat. Rarely had so many vehicles been concentrated in such a small area while attempting to move along limited roads. For the Typhoon pilots, this meant that targets would be everywhere. In many cases, pilots would not need Tozark long to find columns of vehicles attempting to escape eastward. As dawn approached on the days when these missions would take place, the airfields became scenes of intense activity. Mechanics moved quickly between aircraft, completing final checks while pilots climbed into their cockpits. Engines roared to life one after another, sending vibrations across the airfield as the powerful Sabre engines warmed up. Soon the Typhoons began taxiing toward the runways, forming lines as they prepared for takeoff. Within minutes, the aircraft lifted into the sky and formed into groups heading toward the battlefield in Normandy. Ahead of them lay the crowded roads of the Falaise corridor, where thousands of German soldiers and vehicles were attempting to escape the closing pocket. Over the next 72 hours, These skies would witness a relentless series of attacks that would leave a lasting mark on the history of the Normandy campaign. Chapter 2, Segment 3. First Contact. Typhoons enter the battle. When the first waves of Hawker Typhoons crossed the skies over Normandy during the critical days of August 1944, the battlefield below them had already begun to resemble something unlike anything seen earlier in the campaign. The countryside surrounding the Falaise Pocket was filled with movement. From the air, the roads appeared crowded with vehicles heading eastward in long, uneven lines. German forces were attempting to escape before the Allied armies could close the trap entirely, but the pace of their retreat had slowed dramatically. Narrow roads, broken vehicles, and the confusion of thousands of soldiers moving at once had created enormous traffic jams stretching across the countryside. Reconnaissance aircraft had already reported these conditions to Allied command, but for the Typhoon pilots flying toward the battlefield, the full scale of the retreat only became clear once they arrived above the corridor. As the aircraft approached the target area, pilots began spotting the signs that revealed where the German columns were located. Thin lines of dust rose from roads where vehicles were moving across the dry summer terrain. In other places, smoke drifted upward from damaged equipment or burning fuel tanks that had already been struck by earlier attacks. The roads themselves wound through open farmland and small villages, offering little natural cover for the vehicles moving along them. From the perspective of a pilot flying a few thousand feet above the ground, the German retreat could be seen almost as clearly as a map drawn across the countryside. Columns of trucks, armored vehicles, artillery tractors, and horse-drawn wagons stretched along the roads in long formations. Some vehicles were packed so tightly together that they moved slowly, unable to overtake those ahead of them. For Typhoon pilots trained in ground attack operations, this kind of concentration represented an ideal opportunity. Each pass across the road could strike multiple vehicles at once, especially when rockets were used against closely packed targets. The pilots began positioning their aircraft for the first attacks. Flying low and fast, they descended toward the columns of vehicles that had been identified as priority targets. From inside the cockpit, the view of the battlefield changed rapidly. What had appeared from a distance as lines of tiny vehicles now grew larger and clearer with every second. Tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces became distinct shapes as the aircraft closed in. Pilots focused carefully on their aiming sights, aligning their aircraft with the road below before launching their rockets. The first rockets streaked downward toward the columns, leaving trails of smoke behind them. Moments later, explosions erupted along the road as the rockets struck their targets. Some hit vehicles directly, destroying them instantly or setting them on fire. Others exploded nearby, damaging multiple vehicles and forcing drivers to abandon them. Almost immediately after firing their rockets, the Typhoon pilots followed up with bursts from their cannons, sweeping across the road while firing streams of 20mm shells into the crowded vehicles below. For the German soldiers caught in these columns, the arrival of Typhoon aircraft often came with little warning. The roar of engines grew louder as the aircraft approached, but by the time many troops realized what was happening, the attack had already begun. Rockets slammed into vehicles and the surrounding fields, sending debris and dust into the air. Cannon fire rattled across the roadas the aircraft passed overhead, striking trucks, fuel carriers, and artillery pieces. Drivers attempted to steer their vehicles off the roads into nearby fields or behind hedgerows, hoping to escape the attacks. But this often created even greater congestion as vehicles became stuck in soft ground or blocked one another's paths. German anti-aircraft gunners responded as quickly as they could. Many units traveling through the corridor had weapons specifically designed to defend against aircraft. Mounted guns opened fire toward the attacking Typhoons, sending streams of tracer rounds upward into the sky. These glowing lines of ammunition could sometimes be seen clearly by pilots as they streaked past the aircraft during an attack run. For Typhoon pilots, these moments required intense concentration. While lining up their weapons on targets below, they also had to remain alert for anti-aircraft fire that could damage their aircraft or force them to break off the attack. Despite these dangers, the Typhoon squadrons pressed their attacks repeatedly. After completing one pass, pilots often circled back to attack the same column again. In some cases, multiple aircraft struck the same stretch of road in rapid succession. Each new wave of attacks increased the destruction along the routes used by German forces attempting to escape the pocket. Burning vehicles began to block the roads, preventing others from moving forward. Drivers abandoned damaged trucks and tanks, leaving them where they had stopped. Soon entire sections of road became clogged with wreckage, making it even more difficult for the retreating army to continue its movement eastward. From above, the results of these attacks became increasingly visible. Smoke rose from vehicles that had been set on fire, forming dark columns that could be seen for miles across the countryside. Some areas of the corridor soon became scenes of complete gridlock, where vehicles had become trapped behind destroyed equipment blocking the roads ahead. For the Typhoon pilots, these scenes confirmed that their attacks were having the intended effect. Each destroyed truck or tank not only removed a vehicle from the battlefield, but also created an obstacle that slowed or stopped those behind it. As the first day of attacks continued, the skies above the Falaise corridor filled with aircraft returning again and again to strike the retreating columns. What had begun as a desperate German attempt to escape was rapidly turning into a chaotic struggle simply to move forward along roads now under constant attack from the air. Over the next 72 hours, these attacks would intensify even further, creating one of the most destructive air-ground battles of the Normandy campaign. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The Corridor of Chaos, German forces struggle to escape. By the time the battle around the Falaise Pocket reached its most intense phase in mid-August 1944, the situation for German forces attempting to retreat through the narrowing corridor had become increasingly desperate. What had begun as an organized withdrawal quickly turned into a struggle for survival as thousands of soldiers and vehicles attempted to move through a shrinking escape route while Allied armies advanced from multiple directions. The roads leading eastward from the towns of Falaise, Trun, and Chambois became the only paths available for the retreating forces, and these routes soon filled with a mixture of military units, supply convoys, artillery batteries, and exhausted infantry columns. From the perspective of German commanders, the primary objective was simple: move as many troops and vehicles as possible out of the pocket before the Allied forces could close the gap completely. Yet achieving this goal proved extraordinarily difficult. Many of the roads in the region were narrow country routes that had never been intended to carry such enormous volumes of traffic. Trucks loaded with ammunition and supplies crawled forward at slow speeds behind armored vehicles and artillery tractors. Horse-drawn wagons, still used by many German units for transportation, moved even more slowly, adding to the congestion. Infantry soldiers marched along the sides of the roads, often stepping aside whenever vehicles attempted to pass. The result was a chaotic mixture of movement that made rapid progress almost impossible. The situation grew worse whenever a vehicle broke down or was damaged. A single disabled truck or tank could block an entire section off-road, forcing other vehicles to stop behind it. Mechanics worked frantically to repair engines or move damaged equipment aside, but often there was little they could do in the middle of a crowded retreat. As the lines of vehicles grew longer, the traffic jams stretched for miles across the countryside. German officers attempted to maintain order by directing vehicles toward alternative routes or organizing units into more structured columns, but communication between different formations had become difficult. Many units had lost contact with their higher command during the rapid Allied advance. Without clear instructions, some formations simply followed the flow of traffic along whichever road seemed to lead away from the battlefield. The landscape of Normandy added another layer of complexity to the retreat. Although parts of the region contained dense hedgerows that could provide limited concealment, many of the roads leading through the corridor crossed open farmland and rolling hills. These open spaces offered little protection against the constant observation of Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Pilots flying above the battlefield could easily identify the long lines of vehicles moving eastward. Reports describing these columns reached Allied commanders quickly, confirming that large portions of the German army were attempting to escape through the corridor before it was sealed. As the days passed, the growing pressure from Allied air attacks began to transform the retreat into something far more chaotic. The appearance of Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers over the roads added a new threat that German troops could not easily avoid. Aircraft often approached at low altitude and high speed, leaving little time for drivers or soldiers to react before rockets and cannon fire struck the columns. Each attack created confusion among the vehicles below. Drivers attempted to scatter into nearby fields or seek cover behind hedgerows and buildings, but the sheer number of vehicles on the roads made it difficult to move quickly. When rockets struck trucks carrying fuel or ammunition, the resulting explosions sometimes damaged nearby vehicles as well, adding to the growing disorder along the routes of retreat. Anti-aircraft units accompanying the German columns responded whenever aircraft appeared. Guns mounted on trucks or armored vehicles fired rapidly toward the attacking Typhoons, sending bursts of tracer rounds into the sky. These defensive efforts sometimes forced pilots to break off their attacks earlier than planned, but they could not stop the constant waves of aircraft returning again and again throughout the day. For the soldiers trapped in the corridor, the presence of aircraft overhead created a constant sense of tension. Even during moments when no planes were visible, the possibility that another attack might arrive at any moment made every mile of the retreat feel uncertain. Meanwhile, the roads themselves were gradually becoming obstacles rather than escape routes. Destroyed trucks, damaged tanks, and abandoned wagons began to accumulate along the narrow pathways. Some vehicles burned for hours after being struck, sending thick columns of smoke rising into the sky. Other wrecks blocked entire lanes of traffic, forcing drivers to attempt risky detours across fields or narrow side roads. These detours often led to even greater confusion, as vehicles became stuck in soft ground or collided with other columns attempting to use the same routes. From above, the corridor began to resemble a battlefield filled with scattered vehicles andressing smoke rather than an organized retreat. Yet, despite the growing chaos, German soldiers continued moving eastward whenever possible. Many units remained determined to escape the pocket and regroup beyond the reach of the advancing Allied armies. Officers encouraged their troops to keep moving forward, even when the roads ahead appeared crowded or dangerous. For many soldiers, the retreat had become a race against time. Reports circulated through the columns that Allied ground forces were approaching from both the north and the south, threatening to close the gap entirely. If that happened, anyone still inside the corridor would be trapped. As a result, every mile gained along the road felt important. But with every passing hour, the pressure from the air and the advancing Allied forces continued to grow. The corridor that had once seemed wide enough for a retreat was steadily narrowing, and the skies above it were filled with aircraft determined to prevent the German army from escaping intact. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Roads under fire. The air attacks intensify. As the struggle inside the Falaise Pocket continued through the middle days of August 1944, the retreating German columns found themselves facing a threat that returned again and again throughout each day: relentless attacks from the air. What had begun as occasional strikes soon developed into a sustained campaign of ground attack missions designed specifically to disrupt the escape routes of the German army. The skies above the corridor became one of the most dangerous places on the battlefield, not for aircraft, but for the thousands of vehicles attempting to move along the crowded roads below. Allied commanders understood that controlling the skies gave them a decisive advantage. While German forces on the ground tried to organize their retreat, Allied aircraft could observe their movements almost continuously. Reconnaissance planes flew frequent patrols, photographing the roads and reporting where the largest concentrations of obstacles were located. These reports were transmitted quickly to air bases where Typhoon squadrons were preparing their next missions. In briefing rooms, pilots studied maps marked with the latest intelligence, identifying the roads and villages where German traffic appeared most concentrated. The instructions were often straightforward: locate the vehicle columns and disrupt them as effectively as possible. When the Typhoon aircraft approached the corridor, they usually flew at relatively low altitude to avoid early detection. The powerful engines of the aircraft produced a deep, unmistakable roar that echoed across the countryside as the planes moved toward their targets. For German troops traveling along the roads, that sound quickly became a warning that another attack might be moments away. Some drivers attempted to accelerate their vehicles in hopes of reaching cover before the aircraft arrived, but heavy traffic often made this impossible. Others abandoned the roads entirely, steering trucks or armored vehicles into nearby fields where they hoped trees or hedgerows might offer some protection from the air. Yet the open farmland of Normandy provided limited concealment. Once Typhoon pilots spotted a column, they often returned repeatedly to the same area throughout the day. The attack pattern followed a rhythm that soon became familiar to those on the ground. First came the sound of engines growing louder as the aircraft approached. Then, within seconds, rockets streaked downward toward the vehicles clustered along the road. The explosions created bursts of flame and debris that could be seen across the surrounding fields. Immediately afterward, the Typhoons swept low over the columns while firing their powerful cannons, the rapid flashes of gunfire sending streams of shells into trucks, supply wagons, and artillery equipment. After the attack run, the aircraft climbed away, sometimes circling in preparation for another pass. These repeated strikes made it extremely difficult for German forces to maintain any kind of organized movement. Every destroyed vehicle created an obstacle that slowed the column behind it. Drivers were forced to stop and search for alternate routes, often turning into narrow side roads or attempting to drive across farmland that could not support the weight of heavy vehicles. When tanks or large trucks became stuck in soft ground, they blocked the path for others trying to follow. The result was an expanding network of traffic jams that stretched across the countryside. The psychological effect of these air attacks on the soldiers trapped inside the corridor was just as significant as the physical damage they caused. The constant possibility of another strike created a sense of uncertainty that spread through the columns. Even during moments when no aircraft were visible, the soldiers knew that reconnaissance planes might be observing them from high above, guiding the next wave of attackers toward their location. Every distant engine sound or shadow passing across the road could trigger a rush of tension as troops prepared for another attack. German anti-aircraft units did everything they could to defend the columns. Many convoys included vehicles equipped with specialized guns designed to fire rapidly at low-flying aircraft. These weapons opened fire whenever Typhoons approached, filling the air with tracer rounds that streaked upward in bright lines of light. Some gunners attempted to coordinate their fire with nearby units, hoping to create a wall of defensive fire that might force the aircraft to break off their attacks. At times, these defenses succeeded in damaging or discouraging the attacking planes. But the Typhoon pilots were experienced in flying through such conditions. Their aircraft were fast, and their attack runs were designed to minimize the amount of time they spent directly over enemy guns. Even when faced with intense anti-aircraft fire, the Typhoons often completed their attacks before climbing away to prepare for another strike. As the hours passed, the growing number of wrecked vehicles began transforming sections of the corridor into scenes of almost complete gridlock. Burned-out trucks and shattered wagons littered the roadsides, Some tanks remained abandoned where their crews had fled after air attacks damaged the engines or tracks. In place where fuel trucks had been hit, fires burned intensely, sending thick columns of smoke rising into the sky. These smoke plumes became landmarks visible from miles away, guiding new waves of aircraft toward the areas where the heaviest concentrations of vehicles remained trapped. Despite these conditions, German soldiers continued attempting to push eastward whenever possible. Units still hoped that if enough vehicles could escape through the corridor before the Allied armies linked up, at least part of the trapped force might survive. Officers encouraged drivers and infantry alike to keep moving, even if progress came slowly. Yet every hour brought new attacks from the air, and with each strike the roads became more difficult to navigate. What had once been a retreat was gradually turning into a struggle simply to move through a landscape now filled with burning wreckage and constant danger from above. Chapter 3, Segment 3. A battlefield from the sky, the destruction spreads. As the battle within the Falaise Pocket continued to unfold during those decisive days of August 1944, the skies above the corridor became an almost constant presence in the experience of the soldiers trapped below. Aircraft returned repeatedly throughout the daylight hours, sometimes in small groups and sometimes in larger formations, each wave searching for the same targets. The retreating columns of German vehicles attempting to escape the tightening Allied encirclement. For the Typhoon pilots flying these missions, the battlefield presented an unusual and striking sight from above. The narrow roads of the Normandy countryside wound through fields, farms, and small villages, but along these roads were now gathered enormous numbers of military vehicles. From the cockpit of a low-flying aircraft, pilots could see tanks moving slowly behind trucks loaded with supplies, artillery pieces being pulled by tractors, and long lines of infantry marching along the roadside. In many areas, the traffic had already slowed to a crawl because earlier attacks had destroyed vehicles that now blocked the routes forward. These conditions meant that the retreating columns remained exposed to further attacks. Each time a Typhoon squadron arrived over the battlefield, pilots scanned the roads for movement or signs of new concentrations of vehicles. Once a column was identified, the attack usually began with a rapid dive toward the target. The Typhoon's rockets were among its most powerful weapons, capable of causing significant destruction if they struck vehicles directly or exploded among tightly packed convoys. Pilots aimed carefully before firing their rockets in quick bursts. Trails of smoke followed the rockets as they streaked downward, and within moments explosions erupted along the road below. Vehicles were thrown aside or engulfed in flames as the rockets struck. Immediately after releasing their rockets, pilots often switched to their cannons, sweeping low across the road while firing bursts of ammunition into trucks, artillery wagons, and other vehicles caught in the open. For the soldiers on the ground, these attacks often arrived suddenly and ended just as quickly. The sound of aircraft engines might grow louder for only a few seconds before explosions and gunfire filled the air. Drivers tried to steer their vehicles off the road in hopes of finding cover, but with so many vehicles packed together, this was often impossible. When a rocket destroyed a truck in the middle of the road, everything behind it had to stop. Soldiers jumped from vehicles and attempted to push wreckage aside, while officers shouted orders to keep the columns moving. Yet the repeated air attacks made these efforts increasingly difficult. As the day progressed, the accumulation of damaged and destroyed vehicles began to reshape the entire landscape of the corridor. What had once been orderly lines of retreat now appeared as scattered groups of vehicles separated by areas of burning wreckage. Some roads were blocked entirely by destroyed trucks and tanks that could not be moved. In other places, vehicles had attempted to detour across fields or narrow farm paths, creating new traffic jams away from the main routes. From above, the battlefield looked increasingly chaotic. Smoke from burning vehicles drifted upward into the sky, marking the locations where attacks had taken place earlier in the day. These plumes of smoke often served as guides for incoming aircraft, helping pilots locate areas where large concentrations of vehicles were likely still present. In many cases, the presence of smoke indicated that vehicles had already been damaged but not completely destroyed, making them easy targets for follow-up attacks. Typhoon pilots frequently returned to the same locations several times during the day, striking columns that were still attempting to move forward despite the growing destruction around them. German anti-aircraft gunners continued to respond whenever aircraft approached. Streams of tracer fire rose toward the attacking planes, creating dangerous moments for pilots flying low across the battlefield. Some Typhoons were hit by this defensive fire and forced to withdraw from the mission. Even so, the number of Allied aircraft operating in the area meant that the attacks rarely stopped for long. When one group of planes departed, another often arrived soon afterward to continue the assault in the retreating columns. The psychological strain on the soldiers inside the corridor grew steadily. Every attempt to move forward carried the risk of being caught in another airstrike. Even when the skies were temporarily quiet, the wreckage of vehicles along the roads reminded everyone of the danger that could return at any moment. Yet, despite these conditions, many German units continued pushing eastward. Soldiers walked beside the roads while drivers attempted to guide their vehicles around obstacles created by earlier attacks. Officers tried to restore some order among the columns, directing traffic where possible and urging their men to keep moving. Still, the retreat had clearly become something very different from a controlled withdrawal. With every hour, more vehicles were destroyed, more roads were blocked, and more soldiers found themselves trapped in the growing chaos of the pocket. Above them, the Typhoon aircraft continued to patrol the skies, returning again and again to strike the columns below. What had once been an attempt to escape the battlefield was now unfolding into one of the most destructive air-ground encounters of the Normandy campaign, where the combination of trapped forces and relentless air attacks transformed the corridor into a landscape of burning vehicles and stalled convoys struggling to find a way out. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The Rocket Strike, Typhoon Firepower Unleashed. As the battle around the Falaise Pocket intensified during August 1944, the Hawker Typhoon fighter bomber began to demonstrate the full destructive potential that Allied commanders had hoped it would bring to the battlefield. The aircraft had already proven itself capable in earlier operations during the Normandy campaign, but the conditions inside the corridor east of Falaise presented something entirely different. Never before had so many vehicles been gathered within such a confined space while attempting to move along a limited network of roads. For Typhoon pilots flying ground attack missions, this situation created a battlefield where their aircraft's weapons could have a dramatic and immediate impact. The most powerful of those weapons were the rockets mounted beneath the wings of the Typhoon. Each aircraft typically carried 8 rockets, arranged in pairs along rails attached to the wings. These rockets were designed specifically for attacking armored vehicles and fortified positions. When fired from the aircraft, they traveled at high speed toward the target, carrying warheads capable of penetrating heavy armor or producing powerful explosions when they struck. For the pilots who used them, the rockets offered the ability to damage or destroy targets that would otherwise be difficult to attack from the air. During training, Typhoon pilots practiced the techniques required to use these weapons effectively. Attacking a vehicle from the air required careful alignment and timing. The pilot would approach the target at low altitude, then climb slightly before diving toward the vehicle while aiming through the aircraft's sighting system. At the correct moment, the rockets would be fired in quick succession. Because the rockets traveled extremely fast, they reached the target within seconds, leaving little time for the enemy below to react. Once the rockets were released, the pilot usually continued the attack by firing the aircraft's cannons while passing over the target area. In the confined battlefield of the Falaise corridor, these tactics proved particularly effective. The German retreat had created long columns of vehicles moving slowly along narrow roads. In many places, the vehicles were packed closely together because traffic jams had formed where earlier attacks or mechanical failures blocked the path forward. For a Typhoon pilot diving toward such a column, the concentration of vehicles meant that rockets fired at one target could damage several others nearby. A single strike could therefore disrupt an entire section of the retreating convoy. As the aircraft approached these targets, pilots often saw the German vehicles attempting to scatter. Drivers steered trucks into fields or attempted to hide beneath trees along the roadside. Soldiers jumped from vehicles and ran toward nearby ditches or hedgerows in hopes of finding cover. But the suddenness of the attacks often left little time to escape before the rockets struck. Explosions erupted along the roads as rockets hit their targets, sending debris and dust into the air. For those witnessing the attacks from the ground, the effect of the Typhoon rockets could be dramatic. When a rocket struck a truck carrying fuel or ammunition, the resulting explosion sometimes destroyed several nearby vehicles as well. Fuel tanks ignited, sending flames rising high above the road. Ammunition carried by supply vehicles sometimes detonated in bursts that echoed across the surrounding countryside. These explosions not only damaged equipment but also created obstacles that made it even harder for the retreating columns to continue moving eastward. The destruction of even a few vehicles could block an entire stretch of road. Trucks stopped suddenly behind the wreckage, unable to move forward while the path remained blocked. Drivers attempted to reverse or turn their vehicles around, but the narrow roads and crowded conditions often made such maneuvers impossible. Soon the vehicles behind the damaged area became trapped in long lines stretching back across the countryside. These traffic jams created new targets for the aircraft returning overhead. Typhoon pilots frequently reported seeing entire columns halted along the roads, making them easy to attack during subsequent passes. After firing their rockets, many pilots returned to strike the same columns again using their aircraft's cannons. The 4 20mm cannons mounted in the Typhoon's wings were capable of firing hundreds of rounds in a short burst. These shells could easily destroy trucks or disable lighter armored vehicles. Even heavier vehicles could suffer damage if the shells struck vulnerable areas such as engines or exposed equipment. During repeated passes across the road, pilots aimed their cannon fire into the densest clusters of vehicles, increasing the destruction along the retreat routes. German anti-aircraft gunners attempted to respond whenever the Typhoons appeared. Many convoys traveling through the corridor carried weapons designed to defend against aircraft. These guns fired rapidly toward the attacking planes, filling the air with tracer rounds that glowed brightly as they passed through the sky. For Typhoon pilots, the sight of these tracer rounds streaking upward served as a reminder of the risks involved in flying low-level attack missions. Yet the pilots continued their attacks despite the danger. The speed of the Typhoon allowed them to complete their strikes quickly and climb away before defensive fire could become too accurate. As the hours passed and more rockets struck the crowded roads of the corridor, the retreating German forces found themselves facing a growing problem. The destruction caused by these air attacks was not limited to individual vehicles. Each burning truck or disabled tank created a barrier that slowed the movement of everything behind it. The corridor that German forces hoped would carry them safely out of the pocket was gradually becoming clogged with wreckage. Above it all, the Typhoon aircraft continued returning again and again, unleashing the firepower of their rockets against the retreating columns and turning the narrow roads of Normandy into a battlefield dominated by air power. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Cannon Fire and Close Attacks, the Typhoon at Low Altitude. While the rockets carried by the Hawker Typhoon delivered some of the most dramatic blows against the retreating German columns during the battle around the Falaise Pocket, the aircraft's Author weapon system proved just as important in sustaining the relentless pressure from the air. Mounted within the thick wings of the Typhoon were 4 powerful 20mm Hispano cannons, weapons that gave the aircraft tremendous firepower during low-altitude attack runs. Each of these cannons was capable of firing hundreds of rounds in rapid bursts, sending streams of high-velocity shells toward targets on the ground. For the pilots flying these aircraft, the cannons offered an additional method of attack once the rockets had been fired, allowing them to continue striking vehicles as they passed over the crowded roads below. As Typhoon pilots approached the battlefield above the Falaise corridor, they often began their attack runs with rockets aimed at the most visible or heavily armored targets in the columns. Tanks, armored vehicles, and clusters of trucks gathered at road intersections were common rocket targets because the explosive warheads could cause immediate destruction in those areas. But after releasing their rockets, the aircraft still possessed a formidable supply of ammunition for their cannons. Pilots would often descend even lower toward the roads, aligning their aircraft carefully with the direction of the column before pressing the trigger to unleash bursts of cannon fire. From the cockpit, the experience of these attacks required intense concentration and precise control of the aircraft. Flying at low altitude meant that the Typhoon pilots could see individual vehicles clearly as they approached. Trucks carrying supplies, artillery pieces being pulled by tractors, and armored vehicles creeping forward through the traffic jams became visible targets within seconds. The pilot had to judge distance and speed carefully, ensuring that the cannon fire struck the intended vehicles while avoiding obstacles such as trees, buildings, or telephone poles that lined the rural roads. The roar of the aircraft's engine mixed with the sharp vibration of the cannons firing, creating a moment of overwhelming noise inside the cockpit as the aircraft swept across the battlefield. For the German soldiers below, these cannon attacks were often sudden and disorienting. Unlike rockets, which created large explosions visible from a distance, cannon fire arrived in rapid bursts that tore into vehicles with little warning. Shells striking the sides of trucks could disable engines, shatter cargo compartments, or ignite fuel tanks. Artillery equipment hit by cannon rounds sometimes broke apart or became unusable. Even vehicles that were not completely destroyed could be damaged enough to block the road, forcing other drivers behind them to stop and search for alternate routes. As the Typhoons continued flying back and forth across the corridor, the repeated cannon attacks added to the growing disruption along the retreat routes. These low-level attack runs also brought Typhoon pilots dangerously close to the defensive fire of German anti-aircraft units traveling with the retreating columns. Many convoys included vehicles equipped with specialized guns designed to fire rapidly at aircraft flying at low altitude. When Typhoons began their cannon attacks, these guns often opened fire immediately. Streams of tracer ammunition streaked upward through the sky, glowing brightly as they passed the attacking aircraft. For the pilots, these tracer rounds created a vivid and sometimes alarming sight, as the glowing lines of fire rose directly toward their flight path. At such low altitudes, there was little time to evade once the attack had begun. Pilots had to maintain their course long enough to deliver their fire accurately before pulling away and climbing to safer altitude. Despite the danger, the Typhoon squadrons continued carrying out these attacks throughout the day. The aircraft speed allowed them to strike quickly and escape before anti-aircraft fire could become too concentrated. After each attack run, the pilots usually climbed away from the road and circled back to observe the results of their strike. If vehicles were still moving or if new columns had appeared, the pilots sometimes prepared for another pass using their remaining ammunition. Because the German retreat had created such large concentrations of vehicles along the roads, there were rarely shortages of targets. One of the most significant effects of these cannon attacks was the cumulative damage they caused over time. While rockets could destroy vehicles in dramatic explosions, the steady bursts of cannon fire gradually disabled many additional trucks and supply vehicles along the roads. Some vehicles caught fire after being hit, sending smoke rising into the air. Others simply stopped where they stood, their engines damaged or wheels destroyed by the shells. Each disabled vehicle added another obstacle to the crowded retreat routes, making it increasingly difficult for the German columns to continue moving eastward. drivers were forced to steer around wreckage or abandon their vehicles entirely when the road became impassable. As the battle continued, these obstacles began forming chains of wreckage that stretched across sections of the corridor. Burned-out trucks and damaged wagons lined the roadsides, while destroyed vehicles blocked lanes where traffic had once moved freely. The presence of these obstacles slowed the retreat further, creating larger clusters of vehicles that became easy targets for subsequent attacks. From above, Typhoon pilots could see the growing evidence of their strikes. Scattered wreckage, rising smoke, and traffic jams stretching along the narrow roads of Normandy. Each pass of cannon fire contributed to this expanding disruption. What had begun as a determined attempt by German forces to withdraw from the battlefield was gradually turning into a chaotic struggle simply to move through a corridor now filled with damaged vehicles and constant threats from the air. As long as the skies remained under Allied control, the Typhoon squadrons could continue returning to the battlefield, using their cannons and rockets to strike the retreating columns and intensify the pressure on an army already struggling to escape the closing pocket. Chapter 4, Segment 3. A road of wreckage, the corridor begins to collapse. As the attacks from the Hawker Typhoon squadrons continued hour after hour above the Falaise corridor, the physical landscape of the retreat began to change dramatically. The narrow roads that German forces had hoped would carry them safely eastward were gradually transforming into something far more dangerous and difficult to navigate. With each new strike from rockets and cannon fire, additional vehicles were destroyed or disabled, and the wreckage left behind created obstacles that slowed the retreating columns even further. At first, these obstacles appeared in scattered locations along the roads. A truck struck by rockets might burn for several minutes before collapsing into a twisted mass of metal. A tank damaged by cannon fire might stop suddenly in the middle of the road, blocking the path for every vehicle behind it. Drivers attempted to steer around these obstacles whenever possible, guiding their vehicles onto the edge of the road or across nearby farmland. Yet the sheer number of vehicles involved in the retreat made such detours increasingly difficult. In many places, the fields beside the roads were too soft to support heavy vehicles, causing trucks and artillery tractors to become stuck in the ground. When this happened, the vehicle became another obstacle that others had to avoid. As the hours passed, these individual obstacles began linking together to form long stretches of blocked roadway. A single destroyed truck could halt dozens of vehicles behind it, and when those vehicles stopped, they created tightly packed clusters that were easy targets for the next wave of aircraft arriving overhead. Typhoon pilots flying above the battlefield soon began noticing these growing concentrations of vehicles. From their perspective in the sky, the roads below appeared increasingly crowded with trucks, tanks, and wagons that had slowed or stopped completely. For pilots searching for targets, these traffic jams represented ideal opportunities for further attacks. Each new strike had the potential to destroy several vehicles at once, creating even greater disruption along the retreat routes. The German soldiers trapped inside these columns experienced the situation very differently. For them, the retreat had become an exhausting and uncertain journey through a landscape filled with smoke, noise, and constant tension. Drivers waited behind stalled vehicles while officers attempted to organize traffic and clear paths through the wreckage ahead. Mechanics climbed from truck to truck trying to repair engines that had failed during the long retreat. Infantry soldiers walked along the roadside carrying their equipment, watching the sky nervously whenever the sound of aircraft engines echoed across the countryside. Every few minutes someone might shout a warning that planes were approaching, sending soldiers scrambling toward ditches or hedgerows for cover. The combination of damaged vehicles and repeated air attacks gradually created an atmosphere of confusion throughout the corridor. From the air, the transformation of the battlefield became increasingly visible as the day continued. Smoke rose from dozens of locations where vehicles had been struck during earlier attacks. Some fires burned steadily for hours, fed by fuel tanks or ammunition carried in the vehicles. These columns of smoke drifted upward into the sky, forming dark markers that could be seen from miles away. For incoming Typhoon pilots, the smoke often served as a guide toward areas where German columns remained concentrated. If smoke was visible along a particular road, it often meant that vehicles there had already been attacked and that other vehicles might still be trapped behind the wreckage. When aircraft arrived over these areas, they frequently found exactly that situation. Long lines of trucks and armored vehicles halted by destroyed equipment blocking the path ahead. The pilots then prepared for another series of attacks. Rockets were aimed toward the densest clusters of vehicles, while cannon fire swept across the roads during low passes. Each new strike added more wreckage to the growing obstacles along the corridor. German anti-aircraft gunners continued trying to defend the retreating columns from these attacks. Guns mounted on trucks or armored vehicles fired bursts of tracer ammunition whenever aircraft approached. The glowing lines of tracer fire streaked upward through the sky, sometimes forcing pilots to maneuver quickly to avoid being hit. Yet despite these defensive efforts, the constant presence of Allied aircraft meant that the attacks rarely stopped for long. When one group of planes completed its mission and departed, another often arrived shortly afterward to continue the assault. As the battle progressed, some sections of the corridor began to resemble a battlefield filled with scattered wreckage rather than a functioning road network. Burned-out trucks lay at angles along the roadside, their metal frames blackened by fire. Tanks damaged during the retreat remained where they had stopped, sometimes partially blocking the road while crews attempted to repair them or abandon them entirely. Artillery pieces that had been struck during air attacks lay overturned in nearby fields. In places where fuel vehicles had exploded, the ground itself appeared scorched from the intense fires that followed. For the German soldiers still attempting to move through this environment, progress became slower with each passing hour. Columns that once stretched along the roads now broke apart into scattered groups of vehicles separated by damaged equipment and abandoned supplies. Officers struggled to maintain any sense of order as units from different formations mixed together during the retreat. Yet despite the growing chaos, the determination to escape the pocket remained strong among many of the troops. Drivers continued searching for any route that might lead eastward out of the corridor, steering around wreckage or following narrow farm paths whenever possible. But above them, the Typhoon aircraft continued returning again and again, scanning the countryside for signs of movement along the roads. With each attack, the destruction spread further across the retreat routes, and the narrow corridor that had once offered hope of escape increasingly became a landscape filled with burning vehicles, blocked roads, and the relentless presence of aircraft dominating the skies. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The 72 hours air power dominates the pocket. By the time the battle within the Falaise Pocket entered its most critical stage, the skies above the corridor had become one of the most decisive elements shaping the outcome of the retreat. What had begun as scattered air attacks soon evolved into a sustained campaign of strikes that lasted across several days. During roughly 72 hours of intense operations, Allied aircraft, particularly the Hawker Typhoon squadrons, continued flying repeated missions over the roads used by German forces attempting to escape. Each new sortie added pressure to an already chaotic situation on the ground. For the pilots involved in these operations, the pace of activity was relentless. Airfields supporting the Typhoon squadrons operated almost continuously during daylight hours. As one group of aircraft returned from a mission, another group prepared towed part. Ground crews worked quickly to refuel aircraft, reload rockets, and replace ammunition for the powerful cannons mounted in the wings. Mechanics inspected engines and flight controls between missions, ensuring that the aircraft could safely return to the battlefield again within a short period of time. The coordination between pilots and ground crews allowed the Typhoon squadrons to maintain a constant presence over the Falaise corridor. From the perspective of Allied commanders, Maintaining this pressure from the air was essential. The German army trapped within the pocket still possessed large numbers of troops and vehicles, and if too many of them managed to escape eastward, they could regroup and continue resisting the Allied advance deeper into France. Air attacks therefore served two important purposes. First, they directly destroyed vehicles and equipment moving through the corridor. Second, and perhaps even more importantly, they slowed the retreat by creating obstacles that blocked the roads. A single destroyed truck or tank could halt an entire column behind it, making those vehicles easy targets for the next wave of aircraft arriving overhead. For the pilots flying these missions, the battlefield began to feel strangely familiar as the hours passed. Many of them returned to the same sections off road several times during the 72-hour period. They recognized landmarks such as villages, road intersections, and bridges that appeared repeatedly in mission briefings. They also began noticing the growing number of destroyed vehicles left behind from earlier attacks. Burned-out trucks, damaged tanks, and abandoned artillery pieces marked the roads like scars across the countryside. Smoke rising from these wrecks often served as a guide for incoming aircraft, revealing where earlier strikes had taken place and where traffic might still be trapped behind the obstacles. Each new mission followed a similar pattern. The Typhoon aircraft approached the corridor at low altitude, scanning the roads for movement. Once a column of vehicles was spotted, the pilots aligned their aircraft and prepared to attack. Rockets were often fired first, aimed toward the most densely packed vehicles. The explosions created confusion along the Rwada's drivers attempted to escape or find cover. Immediately afterward, the Typhoons swept across the area with cannon fire, striking additional vehicles before climbing away to prepare for another pass. For the German forces trapped within the corridor, the constant presence of aircraft became one of the defining experiences of the retreat. Day after day, the sound of engines overhead signaled that another attack might begin at any moment. Soldiers traveling along the roads learned to watch the sky carefully, searching for the distinctive silhouettes of aircraft approaching at low altitude. Whenever the warning spread through the columns, drivers attempted to move their vehicles away from the road or hide beneath trees and hedgerows. Infantry soldiers often ran toward ditches or nearby buildings in hopes of avoiding the worst of the attack. Yet the sheer number of vehicles and the limited space available along the narrow roads meant that many convoys remained exposed. Traffic jams created by earlier attacks forced vehicles to stop in open areas where they were easily visible from the air. When Typhoon aircraft returned to strike these columns again, the destruction continued to spread along the retreat routes. Some of the most dramatic moments occurred when rockets struck fuel trucks or vehicles carrying ammunition. The explosions that followed could be seen from long distances, sending flames and debris high into the air. Vehicles parked nearby sometimes caught fire as well, creating additional obstacles that blocked the road. In these moments, the retreating columns often descended into confusion as drivers attempted to maneuver around burning wreckage while new aircraft appeared overhead. German anti-aircraft gunners worked tirelessly to defend the convoys from these attacks. Guns mounted on trucks and armored vehicles fired bursts of tracer ammunition toward the attacking planes. The glowing lines of tracer fire created an impressive sight, streaking upward in attempts to drive the aircraft away. Occasionally, these defenses succeeded in damaging an attacking plane or forcing a pilot to break off an attack early. But the overall balance of power in the sky remained firmly in Allied hands. The Typhoon squadrons could return again and again, supported by the overwhelming air superiority established by Allied forces in Normandy. As the 72-hour period progressed, the cumulative impact of these repeated attacks became impossible to ignore. Sections of the corridor were now filled with destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment. Roads that had once been crowded with moving columns were transformed into blocked pathways lined with wreckage. The retreat that German commanders had hoped would allow large portions of their army to escape was becoming increasingly disorganized. Vehicles still attempted to move eastward whenever possible, but progress grew slower with each passing hour. For the pilots flying above the battlefield, the results of their missions were visible everywhere they looked. Smoke rising from damaged convoys, scattered wreckage across the roads, and columns of vehicles halted by obstacles created during earlier attacks. These 72 hours of relentless air operations were gradually reshaping the battle around the Falaise Pocket, turning the narrow escape corridor into one of the most devastating scenes of destruction witnessed during the Normandy campaign. Chapter 5, Segment 2. The Trapped Columns. Retreat turns into gridlock. As the 72 hours of intense air attacks continued over the Falaise corridor, the retreating German columns began experiencing a new and increasingly severe problem. What had started as slow traffic along the roads was gradually turning into complete gridlock across large sections of the retreat routes. Every hour brought additional destruction from air attacks, and each damaged vehicle created another obstacle that prevented the convoys behind it from moving forward. The narrow roads of the Normandy countryside were never designed to carry thousands of military vehicles attempting to pass through them at once. Now, with wreckage scattered across the routes, those roads were becoming almost impossible to navigate. For the German drivers guiding trucks and armored vehicles eastward, the experience became increasingly frustrating and dangerous. Convoys that once moved slowly now stopped entirely as drivers waited for the path ahead to clear. Some officers attempted to organize their units into smaller groups that could move more easily through the congestion, but the constant pressure of air attacks made such coordination extremely difficult. Whenever aircraft appeared overhead, vehicles scattered off the road in attempts to avoid becoming targets. When the attack ended, drivers struggled to find their place in the column again. The result was a chaotic mixture of vehicles from many different units attempting to move along the same narrow routes. One of the most common causes of gridlock came from vehicles damaged during the air attacks themselves. A truck struck by cannon fire might lose its engine power and stop abruptly in the center of the road. A tank hit by rockets might block both lanes of a narrow country road, preventing anything from passing until the wreckage could be pushed aside. Yet pushing such vehicles aside was rarely easy. Many trucks were loaded with heavy supplies such as ammunition, fuel barrels, or artillery shells. Tanks and armored vehicles weighed many tons and could not simply be moved by hand. Mechanics and soldiers sometimes attempted to tow damaged vehicles away using other trucks, but such efforts often required time that the retreating columns did not have. While these efforts took place, the vehicles behind the wreckage remained stuck in place. The longer the columns remained halted, the more vulnerable they became to further attacks from the air. Typhoon pilots flying above the battlefield quickly learned to recognize these traffic jams as ideal targets. When a pilot spotted a long line of vehicles stopped along the road, it meant that the convoy had little ability to escape before an attack could begin. Rockets and cannon fire directed into these clusters could damage multiple vehicles at once, increasing the destruction along the retreat routes. Each new strike added to the wreckage already blocking the roads, creating an expanding chain of obstacles that stretched across the countryside. From the perspective of the soldiers trapped inside these columns, the sense of urgency grew stronger with every passing hour. Many of them were aware that Allied ground forces were advancing from multiple directions around the pocket. Reports circulated among the troops that American units were moving northward while Canadian and Polish forces pushed south toward the corridor. If those armies succeeded in linking up, the escape route would close completely, trapping everyone still inside the pocket. This knowledge created pressure on officers and drivers alike to keep moving whenever possible. Yet the conditions along the roads made rapid movement increasingly unrealistic. In some places, drivers attempted to bypass the blocked roads by steering vehicles across fields or along narrow farm paths. These improvised routes sometimes worked for lighter vehicles, but heavy trucks and tanks often became stuck in the soft ground of the farmland. When that happened, The vehicle became yet another obstacle for others trying to follow the same path. Soon these off-road detours created their own traffic jams, with vehicles scattered across the fields while drivers attempted to find another way forward. Meanwhile, the sky above the corridor remained filled with the constant threat of aircraft. Typhoon squadrons continued flying missions throughout the day, searching for signs of movement along the retreat routes. Smoke rising from earlier attacks made it easier for pilots to locate the areas where convoys were still trapped. When aircraft appeared overhead, soldiers once again abandoned vehicles and sought whatever cover they could find. Drivers sometimes shut off engines and hid nearby, hoping that the aircraft would pass without noticing them. But when vehicles were clustered together in long lines, they were difficult to conceal from pilots scanning the roads below. German anti-aircraft units attempted to defend these convoys as best they could. Guns mounted on trucks and armored vehicles fired bursts of tracer ammunition whenever aircraft approached. The bright streaks of tracer rounds filled the air as gunners tried to drive the attackers away. Although these defenses occasionally forced pilots to adjust their attack runs, they rarely stopped the strikes entirely. The Typhoon aircraft were fast and heavily armed, allowing them to strike quickly before climbing away beyond the reach of the guns. As the day continued, the gridlock within the corridor became more severe. Roads that had once carried long columns of moving vehicles were now filled with burned-out trucks, damaged tanks, and abandoned wagons. Some soldiers simply left their vehicles behind and continued the retreat on foot, hoping to move more quickly through the countryside. Others attempted to repair damaged trucks or push wreckage aside in desperate efforts to reopen the roads. But with each new air attack adding more destruction to the scene, the corridor was gradually transforming into a battlefield filled with stalled convoys and scattered debris. For the Allied pilots flying overhead, the results of these operations were becoming increasingly clear. The retreating German army was no longer moving as a coordinated force. Instead, it was breaking apart into scattered groups of vehicles struggling to escape through a corridor that had become increasingly clogged with wreckage. The combination of gridlocked roads and relentless air attacks was turning the retreat into a desperate struggle for survival, where every mile gained came at the cost of navigating through a landscape shaped by fire, smoke, and destruction from above. Chapter 5, Segment 3. The battlefield of wreckage, air power reshapes the pocket. As the 72 hours of continuous air attacks progressed over the Falaise corridor, the landscape itself began to reflect the cumulative impact of the battle unfolding there. What had originally been a network of rural roads connecting quiet farms and small Norman villages was gradually transformed into a battlefield dominated by wrecked vehicles, scattered equipment, and the persistent smoke of burning fuel and supplies. For those witnessing the scene from above, the transformation was dramatic. Pilots flying reconnaissance and ground attack missions reported seeing roads lined with damaged trucks, overturned wagons, and tanks that had been abandoned after suffering mechanical failures or air attack damage. In many places, the retreat routes had become nearly impossible to recognize as functioning roads at all. The destruction spread slowly but steadily with every new wave of attacks. Rockets fired from Typhoon aircraft struck vehicles clustered along the roads, while cannon fire damaged others attempting to move forward through the congestion. Each destroyed truck or armored vehicle created a barrier that slowed the movement of those behind it. When drivers attempted to steer around the wreckage, they often ended up blocking other routes or becoming stuck in nearby fields. This process gradually expanded the zones of congestion across the corridor. Entire stretches of road became filled with stalled convoys that could neither move forward nor turn around easily. For German soldiers trapped inside these columns, the retreat had turned into a test of endurance and patience. Hours passed while drivers waited for obstacles ahead to be cleared. Mechanics climbed beneath trucks attempting to repair damaged engines or replace broken parts, while officers tried to restore order among the growing mass of vehicles belonging to many different units. Soldiers walked along the roads carrying their equipment, scanning the sky nervously whenever the distant sound of aircraft engines echoed across the countryside. Even brief moments of quiet felt temporary, because everyone knew that another wave of aircraft might appear at any moment. From the air, the Typhoon pilots observed the growing signs of disruption across the corridor. The long lines of vehicles that had once stretched along the roads were now broken into scattered clusters separated by damaged equipment and burning wreckage. Smoke rising from destroyed trucks created dark columns visible from miles away, often serving as guides for pilots searching for new targets. These smoke plumes also revealed how widespread the destruction had become. What had started as individual strikes against specific columns was gradually turning into a pattern of damage spread across the entire escape route. The effect of this widespread destruction went beyond the immediate damage to vehicles and equipment. It also disrupted the coordination of the German retreat in ways that became increasingly difficult to repair. Military units that had once traveled together in organized formations now found themselves scattered among other units trying to escape through the same corridor. Trucks from one division might become trapped behind tanks belonging to another, while artillery crews searched for tractors capable of pulling their guns through the blocked roads. Communication between commanders grew more difficult as vehicles carrying radio equipment were damaged or abandoned during the retreat. Without reliable communication, coordinating movement through the crowded corridor became nearly impossible. At the same time, the pressure from Allied ground forces continued to grow around the edges of the pocket. While the air attacks dominated the skies above the corridor, Allied armies were steadily advancing closer from the north and south. These advances reduced the width of the escape route available to German forces. Each mile gained by Allied troops meant that the corridor became narrower, forcing the retreating columns into an even smaller area where congestion increased further. This tightening of the battlefield made the air attacks even more effective. With fewer roads available for escape, the retreating vehicles became concentrated in specific areas that were easier for pilots to locate and attack. German anti-aircraft gunners remained active throughout the battle, firing whenever aircraft approached the columns. Their guns produced rapid bursts of tracer fire that filled the sky with glowing streaks of light. In some cases, these defenses forced Typhoon pilots to adjust their attack angles or break away earlier than planned. But the constant rotation of Allied aircraft meant that the attacks rarely stopped completely. When one squadron finished its mission and returned to base, another group often arrived soon afterward to continue striking the retreating columns. For the soldiers attempting to move through the corridor, the combination of gridlocked roads, advancing Allied ground forces, and relentless air attacks created a situation that felt increasingly hopeless. Vehicles were abandoned when they could no longer move forward. Some soldiers left the roads entirely, attempting to continue the retreat on foot through fields and small villages. Others remained with their vehicles, hoping that a path might eventually open through the wreckage ahead. Meanwhile, the Typhoon pilots continued scanning the battlefield from above, searching for signs of movement among the stalled columns. Whenever a new concentration of vehicles appeared, the aircraft descended once again, unleashing rockets and cannon fire into the crowded roads. Over time, the retreating German forces found themselves navigating not only the narrow countryside of Normandy, but also a landscape increasingly shaped by the destructive power of air attacks. The corridor that had once offered a chance of escape was now becoming a battlefield filled with smoke, wreckage, and stalled convoys struggling to move forward under skies dominated by Allied aircraft. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Fear from the Sky, the Psychological Impact of Air Attack. As the battle within the Falaise Pocket continued during those critical days of August 1944, the effect of the Typhoon attacks extended far beyond the physical destruction of vehicles and equipment along the retreat routes. While rockets and cannon fire damaged trucks, tanks, and supply wagons, The constant presence of aircraft overhead also produced a powerful psychological impact on the soldiers trapped inside the corridor. For many of them, the experience of retreating under the continuous threat of air attack became one of the most difficult aspects of the entire battle. Every moment along the roads carried the possibility that another wave of aircraft might appear without warning. The soldiers traveling through the corridor quickly learned to recognize the early signs that an attack might be approaching. Sometimes the first indication came as a distant rumbling sound that gradually grew louder as aircraft engines echoed across the countryside. At other times, the warning came from someone pointing toward the sky after spotting the dark shapes of aircraft approaching at low altitude. When these warnings spread along the columns, drivers often reacted immediately by attempting to steer their vehicles away from the road. Trucks moved toward nearby fields or narrow farm paths where trees and hedgerows might offer some protection. Infantry soldiers frequently abandoned the vehicles entirely and ran toward ditches, walls, or buildings where they hoped to find cover from the attack. These reactions became almost instinctive after several days of repeated airstrikes. Even before the first rockets were fired, the appearance of aircraft could send waves of tension through the retreating columns. Soldiers who had already witnessed earlier attacks understood how quickly rockets could strike and how little time there was to escape once an aircraft began its dive. The fear created by this uncertainty spread easily through the crowded roads where thousands of soldiers and drivers were traveling close together. When one person shouted that aircraft were approaching, the warning often passed rapidly from vehicle to vehicle, triggering hurried attempts to hide or scatter. From the perspective of the Typhoon pilots flying above the battlefield, these reactions sometimes became visible during their approach. As the aircraft descended toward the roads, pilots occasionally saw vehicles turning suddenly away from the column or soldiers running across nearby fields. These movements often confirmed that the aircraft had been spotted. But even when drivers attempted to hide their vehicles beneath trees or near buildings, the dense traffic along the retreat routes made complete concealment difficult. In many places, the vehicles were simply too numerous and too closely packed together to disappear from view entirely. For the German soldiers experiencing these attacks from the ground, the psychological pressure created by the constant threat from the sky gradually built into a state of continuous tension. Unlike artillery bombardments, which often occurred for limited periods before stopping, the air attacks could appear repeatedly throughout the day without any clear pattern. 1 hour might pass quietly with no aircraft visible, only to be followed suddenly by the roar of engines and the explosions of rockets striking the road. This unpredictability made it difficult for soldiers to relax or regain a sense of control over the situation. Drivers attempting to guide their vehicles through the corridor faced particularly stressful conditions. Many of them were responsible not only for their own safety but also for the supplies or equipment they were transporting. Trucks carried fuel, ammunition, food supplies, and spare parts needed by the retreating army. Losing these vehicles during an air attack meant losing valuable resources that might be needed later in the campaign. Yet drivers also knew that remaining inside a truck during an attack could be extremely dangerous if rockets or cannon fire struck the vehicle directly. As a result, many drivers faced difficult decisions about whether to stay with their vehicles or abandon them temporarily when aircraft appeared overhead. The repeated disruptions caused by air attacks also affected the organization of the retreat itself. Whenever aircraft approached, vehicles scattered from the roads or stopped abruptly as soldiers sought cover. After the attack ended, drivers often struggled to return to the correct positions within their columns. Units became mixed together as trucks from different formations attempted to resume movement along the same narrow routes. Officers shouted instructions while trying to restore order among the vehicles, but the crowded conditions made coordination extremely difficult. Meanwhile, the growing wreckage along the roads served as constant reminders of earlier attacks. Burned-out trucks and damaged tanks remained where they had been destroyed, their blackened frames visible to every soldier passing through the corridor, and in some places the remains of vehicles that had exploded during rocket strikes were scattered across the roadside, creating a stark illustration of the danger posed by aircraft overhead. These scenes reinforced the tension already present among the retreating troops. Every soldier moving past the wreckage knew that another attack might arrive at any moment. Even during the brief periods when the sky remained quiet, the psychological weight of these experiences lingered. Soldiers walked or drove through a landscape marked by the evidence of destruction from previous airstrikes, never entirely certain when the next wave of aircraft might appear. Above them, the Typhoon squadrons continued patrolling the skies, ready to return whenever reconnaissance reports revealed new concentrations of vehicles attempting to escape the pocket. In this way, the air attacks affected not only the physical progress of the retreat, but also the morale and mental state of the soldiers trapped within it. The fear of sudden attack from above became an inseparable part of the experience of moving through the corridor, shaping how the retreat unfolded during those decisive days of the Normandy campaign. Chapter 6, Segment 2. The Pilot's Perspective, Flying the Attack Missions. While the retreating German forces inside the Falaise corridor experienced the battle as a desperate struggle to move through congested roads under constant threat from the air, the pilots flying the Hawker Typhoons experienced the same battlefield from a very different perspective. For them, the battle was defined by a demanding cycle of preparation, flight, attack, and return that repeated itself several times a day. Each mission required concentration, discipline, and precise coordination with other aircraft in the squadron. Although the Typhoon was a powerful aircraft designed for ground attack missions, flying low over an active battlefield always carried significant risks. Every sortie began at the airfields where the squadrons were based. Some of these airfields were located in southern England, while others had already been established in newly captured territory in France as the Allied armies advanced across Normandy. The morning routine at these airfields often started with mission briefings where pilots gathered in rooms filled with maps and reconnaissance photographs. Intelligence officers described the situation inside the Falaise Pocket, pointing out roads where large concentrations of German vehicles had been observed. Photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft revealed long lines of trucks and armored vehicles attempting to move eastward through the corridor. These images helped the pilots understand where their attacks were likely to have the greatest impact. During these briefings, squadron leaders explained the routes the aircraft would follow to reach the target area. Pilots studied the maps carefully, noting villages, rivers, and other landmarks that would help them recognize the correct roads once they arrived over the battlefield. Because the attacks would be carried out at low altitude, accurate navigation was essential. Flying even a few miles off course could mean missing the columns of vehicles entirely or encountering unexpected anti-aircraft defenses. After the briefing ended, the pilots walked across the airfield toward their aircraft. Ground crews had already begun preparing the Typhoons for the mission. Mechanics inspected the powerful Napier Sabre engines while armorers carefully mounted rockets beneath the wings and loaded ammunition belts into the 420mm cannons. Fuel tanks were filled, control surfaces checked, and communication equipment tested to ensure that everything functioned correctly before takeoff. The pilots climbed into the cockpits, fastening their harnesses and adjusting instruments while waiting for the signal to start their engines. Soon the deep roar of multiple engines echoed across the airfield as the Typhoons came to life one after another. When the signal for departure arrived, the aircraft taxied toward the runway and lifted into the sky, forming into groups that headed toward Normandy. Once airborne and crossing the English Channel or flying from bases already established in France, the pilots began preparing mentally for the attack missions ahead. Flying a Typhoon at low altitude required constant attention to the terrain below. The aircraft moved at high speed, and obstacles such as hills, buildings, and power lines could appear suddenly if the pilot was not focused. As the aircraft approached the battlefield around the Falaise corridor, the pilots usually descended closer to the ground to avoid early detection and to improve their chances of spotting vehicle columns along the roads. From this altitude, the pilots began scanning the countryside carefully. The roads winding through the farmland often revealed the locations of German columns through visible movement or dust rising from the vehicles. Sometimes smoke rising from earlier air attacks also marked the locations where convoys had already been struck and where additional vehicles might still be trapped behind wreckage. When a column was identified, the squadron prepared for the attack. The aircraft separated slightly to give each pilot room to maneuver during the dive toward the target. One by one, the Typhoons descended toward the road below, aligning their sights with the vehicles they intended to strike. Rockets were often used first against clusters of trucks or armored vehicles. The pilot pressed the firing control, and the rockets shot forward from the rails beneath the wings, leaving thin trails of smoke as they raced toward the road. Seconds later, explosions erupted among the vehicles, sending debris and dust into the air. Immediately after releasing their rockets, the pilots often switched to their cannons. As the aircraft swept across the road at low altitude, bursts of cannon fire struck trucks, artillery pieces, and other vehicles caught in the column. The attack run usually lasted only a few seconds before the pilot pulled the aircraft upward and away from the road to avoid ground fire and prepare for another pass if ammunition remained. These moments required intense concentration because German anti-aircraft guns often responded quickly once the attack began. Tracer rounds streaked upward through the sky, forcing the pilots to maneuver carefully while still completing their strike. After completing the attack, the Typhoons usually climbed away from the target area and regrouped with other aircraft from the squadron. Some missions involved returning to base immediately after the attack, while others allowed the pilots to circle back and search for additional targets along nearby roads. Once their fuel or ammunition ran low, the aircraft headed back toward their airfields where ground crews prepared them for the next sortie. This cycle of briefings, takeoffs, attacks, and returns continued repeatedly throughout the 72 hours of intense operations around the Falaise Pocket. From the pilot's perspective, each mission blended together with the next, forming a continuous effort to disrupt the retreating German army. Yet even as the pilots focused on their individual attack runs, they could see the larger effect of these missions taking shape across the countryside below. Roads once filled with moving convoys now appeared clogged with wreckage and stalled vehicles, clear signs that the relentless pressure from the air was steadily reshaping the battle unfolding within the corridor. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Coordination with the ground war, air and land closing the trap. While the Hawker Typhoon squadrons were carrying out relentless attacks against German vehicles inside the Falaise corridor, another crucial part of the battle was unfolding on the ground. The Allied armies advancing across Normandy were steadily moving closer to the narrow escape route through which the German forces were attempting to withdraw. The success of the air attacks depended not only on the destructive power of rockets and cannon fire, but also on the coordination between aircraft in the sky and the armies advancing across the countryside below. Together, these two elements formed a strategy designed to trap and weaken the German forces inside the pocket before they could escape to the east. By mid-August 1944, the Allied advance across Normandy had accelerated dramatically. After weeks of difficult fighting through the hedgerow countryside, American forces had broken through German defensive lines and begun pushing rapidly across the region. At the same time, British and Canadian forces were advancing from the north toward the towns of Falaise, Trun, and Chambois. These movements created a dangerous situation for the German army still fighting in Normandy. If the Allied forces approaching from the north and south managed to link up, the German units trapped between them would be surrounded completely. German commanders recognized this danger and ordered their forces to retreat eastward through the corridor while it was still open. Yet the Allied commanders were fully aware of what was happening. Reconnaissance aircraft provided regular reports about the movement of German vehicles along the roads leading out of the pocket. These reports allowed Allied planners to predict where the retreating columns would appear and which routes they would likely attempt to use. Ground forces advancing toward the corridor were instructed to move quickly to narrow the escape route as much as possible. Meanwhile, Typhoon squadrons and other Allied aircraft continued attacking the columns from above to slow their progress. This coordination between ground and air forces created a powerful combination. When Typhoon aircraft destroyed vehicles along the roads, they blocked the retreat routes and delayed the movement of German units attempting to escape. These delays bought valuable time for Allied ground troops advancing toward the corridor from multiple directions. Each hour gained by the air attacks allowed the advancing armies to move closer to the roads used by the retreating forces. In this way, the airstrikes did not simply destroy equipment. They also helped shape the timing of the battle unfolding on the ground. For the soldiers moving with the Allied armies, the results of the air attacks often became visible as they approached areas previously targeted by aircraft. Roads were littered with destroyed trucks and abandoned equipment left behind during the retreat. Some vehicles remained burned and twisted along the roadside, their metal frames blackened by fire. Others had been pushed aside by soldiers attempting to clear paths for advancing units. These scenes offered clear evidence that the air attacks had already disrupted the German retreat long before Allied ground troops reached those locations. The presence of Typhoon aircraft overhead also provided encouragement to the Allied soldiers advancing through Normandy. Ground troops had come to recognize the distinctive sound of the Typhoon's powerful engine as it approached the battlefield. Whenever the aircraft appeared overhead, soldiers often watched as the planes descended toward enemy vehicles or positions ahead of the advancing army. The explosions of rockets and the bursts of cannon fire signaled that the aircraft were striking targets that might otherwise slow the ground advance. In many cases, these airstrikes helped clear the path for Allied units moving toward the corridor. At the same time, the German forces trapped inside the pocket found themselves facing pressure from multiple directions at once. While they struggled to move through roads clogged with wreckage caused by air attacks, Allied ground forces continued closing in from the north and south. The corridor available for escape grew narrower with every mile gained by the advancing armies. Vehicles that had once been able to move relatively freely along several different routes were now forced into fewer roads as the pocket tightened. This concentration made the air attacks even more effective. With more vehicles crowded into smaller areas, Typhoon pilots could easily identify targets and deliver attacks that caused significant disruption to the retreating columns. German commanders attempted to maintain some order among their units despite these conditions. Officers directed soldiers to keep moving whenever possible, urging drivers to push vehicles through the remaining open roads before the corridor closed completely. Yet the combination of air attacks, blocked roads, and advancing Allied armies made coordination increasingly difficult. Units that had once operated together became scattered among other formations trying to escape through the same routes. As this situation developed, the battle around the Falaise Pocket was gradually shifting toward its final stage. The efforts of the Typhoon squadrons in the sky and the Allied armies on the ground were working together to reduce the chances that large numbers of German vehicles and troops could escape intact. For the retreating forces moving eastward through the corridor, every mile of progress required navigating a battlefield shaped by two powerful forces: relentless attacks from above and the steady advance of armies closing the trap from the ground. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The narrowing gap, the escape route begins to close. As the battle within the Falaise Pocket moved toward its final stages in mid-August 1944, the corridor through which German forces hoped to escape grew steadily smaller. What had once been a relatively wide opening in the Allied lines was now narrowing with every hour as Allied ground forces advanced from both the north and the south. For the German soldiers and drivers struggling through the crowded retreat routes, this shrinking gap created a growing sense of urgency. The possibility of escape still existed, but it depended on moving through the corridor before the Allied armies succeeded in closing it completely. The geography of the region played an important role in shaping this moment of the battle. The corridor was formed by a network off-roads connecting towns and villages such as Falaise, Trun, and Chambois. These roads crossed open farmland and small wooded areas typical of the Normandy countryside. Under normal circumstances, such terrain allowed vehicles to move relatively freely between fields and narrow lanes. But during the retreat from the pocket, thousands of German vehicles attempted to move through this limited space at the same time. Trucks loaded with supplies, armored vehicles, artillery tractors, and horse-drawn wagons all competed for room along the same roads. The result was a dense concentration of vehicles that moved slowly even under the best conditions. By this stage of the battle, however, the conditions were far from ideal. Days of air attacks had left sections of the corridor littered with wreckage. Destroyed trucks blocked parts of the road, forcing drivers to steer their vehicles around burned-out remains. Tanks damaged by rockets or mechanical failures often remained where they had stopped, creating obstacles that slowed the columns behind them. In many areas, the roads were no longer clear paths, but rather narrow channels winding through scattered wreckage. Every attempt to move forward required careful navigation around damaged equipment and abandoned supplies left behind during the retreat. As the roads became increasingly crowded, officers tried to maintain some form of organization within the columns. They directed vehicles toward particular routes and attempted to separate different units so that the retreat could proceed more smoothly. But the constant pressure from air attacks and the confusion of mixed units made such coordination extremely difficult. Drivers often followed whichever vehicle appeared to be moving ahead of them, regardless of which unit it belonged to. Infantry soldiers walked beside the vehicles, sometimes helping push damaged trucks aside or guiding drivers through narrow passages between obstacles. While this struggle unfolded on the roads inside the corridor, Allied ground forces continued advancing steadily toward the escape route. Canadian and Polish units approached from the north, capturing villages and strategic road junctions that brought them closer to the German retreat paths. At the same time, American forces moved northward from the south, pushing through remaining German resistance and closing the distance toward the same narrow corridor. These advances meant that the open space between the Allied armies was shrinking hour by hour. For the German forces attempting to escape, this meant that time was rapidly running out. The pressure from the air intensified the situation further. Typhoon aircraft continued flying missions over the corridor, searching for the clusters of vehicles still attempting to move eastward. Because the retreat routes had become more concentrated as the pocket narrowed, the aircraft could easily locate new targets. Columns that once spread across several roads were now forced into fewer routes, creating dense groups of vehicles visible from the air. Whenever these groups were discovered, the Typhoons descended once again, firing rockets and cannon shells into the columns below. These attacks caused additional damage that slowed the retreat even further. Every vehicle destroyed during an airstrike created another obstacle that blocked the already crowded roads. Drivers trapped behind these obstacles had to wait while soldiers attempted to clear the path or search for alternate routes across nearby fields. But the narrowing corridor left fewer opportunities for detours. Many vehicles simply remained stuck in place, waiting for the wreckage ahead to be moved aside. The soldiers moving through the corridor could see the effects of this tightening trap around them. In the distance, artillery fire from the advancing Allied armies sometimes echoed across the countryside. The sound of battle at the edges of the pocket reminded everyone that the corridor might not remain open for much longer. Yet despite the growing danger, the determination to escape remained strong among many of the retreating troops. Drivers continued guiding their vehicles through narrow passages between wreckage, while infantry soldiers marched beside the roads hoping to reach safety beyond the pocket. Some vehicles managed to pass through the corridor and continue eastward, but many others remained trapped within the crowded retreat routes. As the hours passed, The battle inside the Falaise Pocket became increasingly defined by this race between movement and closure. German forces attempted to push through the narrowing escape route while Allied armies advanced from both sides to seal its hut. Above them, Typhoon aircraft continued circling the skies, ready to strike the crowded columns whenever they appeared along the remaining roads. Together, these forces created a battlefield where every mile of progress mattered, and where the corridor that once offered hope of escape was gradually turning into a narrowing passage through which fewer and fewer vehicles could pass. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The Closing Trap. Ground Forces Meet the Air War. As the battle around the Falaise Pocket approached its most decisive phase, the retreating German forces inside the corridor faced a rapidly changing battlefield. What had once been a wide region through which thousands of vehicles attempted to escape was now narrowing under the pressure of advancing Allied armies. At the same time, the skies above the corridor remained dominated by Allied aircraft that continued striking the retreat routes whenever new concentrations of vehicles appeared. The combination of these two forces, ground troops advancing steadily and aircraft attacking from above, created a situation that left the retreating German units with fewer and fewer options for escape. The Allied ground forces advancing toward the corridor had spent weeks fighting through the difficult terrain of Normandy. Villages surrounded by hedgerows and fields had been defended stubbornly by German troops earlier in the campaign. But by mid-August, the balance of the battle had shifted. German defensive lines were breaking apart as units withdrew toward the east, attempting to regroup beyond the reach of the advancing Allied armies. This withdrawal brought enormous numbers of vehicles and soldiers into the narrow corridor near Falaise, Trun, and Chambois. As Allied troops pushed closer to these locations, they began encountering clear signs of the retreating army's struggle to escape. Roads leading toward the corridor were often littered with damaged vehicles that had been struck during earlier air attacks. Burned trucks and abandoned equipment lined the roadsides, while fields nearby sometimes contained vehicles that had attempted to leave the roads during attacks from aircraft overhead. For Allied soldiers moving through these areas, the wreckage offered a vivid illustration of the intense air campaign that had already taken place above the battlefield. Yet the presence of destroyed vehicles also showed that the German retreat was slowing under the combined pressure of ground and air attacks. Commanders on the Allied side understood that timing was crucial. The longer the corridor remained open, the more German units would manage to escape the pocket. For this reason, Allied forces were urged to advance as quickly as possible toward the narrow gap that still connected the retreating German columns to the east. Canadian and Polish units pushed southward toward key roads near Trun and Chambois, while American forces continued advancing northward from the opposite direction. The goal was simple: close the corridor and trap as many German forces as possible inside the pocket. While the ground forces advanced toward one another, the Typhoon squadrons continued their missions overhead, striking the same retreat routes that German vehicles were desperately trying to use. The aircraft had already caused significant damage to the columns moving through the corridor, but as the pocket narrowed, their attacks became even more effective. With fewer roads available for escape, the retreating vehicles became increasingly concentrated in specific areas. These concentrations made it easier for pilots to locate targets and deliver attacks that caused further disruption to the retreat. Typhoon pilots approaching the battlefield often recognized the signs of congestion even before spotting the vehicles themselves. Smoke rising from earlier attacks indicated areas where convoys had already been struck. Dust clouds drifting above certain roads revealed the movement of vehicles attempting to continue the retreat. As the aircraft descended toward these locations, the pilots frequently discovered long lines of trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces moving slowly or waiting for obstacles ahead to be cleared. Once the targets were identified, the familiar attack pattern began again. Rockets streaked downward toward the roads, followed by bursts of cannon fire that swept across the columns. Each strike created additional wreckage that blocked the retreat routes. For the German soldiers trapped in the corridor, these attacks made an already difficult journey even more dangerous. Drivers who had managed to guide their vehicles around earlier obstacles now faced new barriers created by fresh explosions along the road. Some attempted to steer into nearby fields, but the soft ground often trapped heavy trucks and armored vehicles before they could travel far. As the hours passed, the corridor began to resemble a battlefield filled with stalled convoys rather than an organized route of retreat. German officers continued urging their men forward, hoping that enough vehicles could escape before the Allied armies closed the gap completely. Yet the pressure from both ground and air forces made every mile more difficult than the last. Soldiers moving along the roads could sometimes hear distant artillery from the advancing Allied troops, a reminder that the closing trap was drawing nearer. At the same time, the roar of aircraft engines overhead signaled that the skies remained under Allied control. Whenever Typhoon aircraft appeared, the retreating columns once again scattered in attempts to avoid becoming targets. These repeated interruptions slowed the retreat even further, buying valuable time for the Allied ground forces approaching from opposite directions. As the distance between those forces grew smaller, the fate of the German army inside the pocket became increasingly uncertain. The corridor that still allowed some vehicles to escape was narrowing steadily, and the combination of advancing armies and relentless air attacks was gradually transforming the retreat into a desperate race against time. Chapter 7, Segment 3. The Last Attempts to Escape: A Race Against Time. As the battle around the Falaise Pocket approached its final and most desperate phase, the remaining German forces inside the corridor faced a moment of urgent decision. The escape route that still existed between the advancing Allied armies was now dangerously narrow, and every hour brought the opposing forces closer together. German commanders understood that if the corridor closed completely, tens of thousands of troops and large quantities of equipment would be trapped inside the pocket. For this reason, the retreat during these final stages became a frantic effort to move as many soldiers and vehicles eastward as possible before the opportunity vanished. Along the crowded roads inside the corridor, the signs of urgency were visible everywhere. Drivers pushed their trucks forward whenever even a small opening appeared in the traffic ahead. Tanks moved slowly through narrow gaps between burned vehicles, sometimes scraping past wreckage that had been pushed to the sides of the road. Infantry soldiers marched beside the vehicles or rode on the backs of trucks, determined to keep moving no matter how slow the progress became. Many of the units attempting to escape were no longer organized in their original formations. During days of fighting and retreat, divisions had become mixed together as vehicles from different units merged along the same roads. Officers attempted to direct traffic where possible, but the constant congestion made it difficult to maintain clear lines of command. In many places, the retreat resembled a stream of vehicles and soldiers moving together toward the same distant goal, rather than a carefully coordinated withdrawal. The obstacles created by earlier air attacks made the retreat even more difficult. Burned-out trucks and damaged tanks remained scattered along the roads, forcing drivers to steer carefully around them. Some wreckage had been pushed into nearby ditches or fields by soldiers attempting to clear the roads, but much of it remained in place because the heavy vehicles could not easily be moved. In some areas, the road surface itself had been damaged by explosions, leaving deep craters that slowed vehicles attempting to pass through. Each of these obstacles forced drivers to slow down, and each delay increased the risk that the corridor might close before the vehicles could escape. Above the retreating columns, the skies remained filled with the constant presence of Allied aircraft. Typhoon squadrons continued patrolling the corridor, searching for the clusters of obstacles that had formed along the remaining escape routes. Because the retreat had now become concentrated along fewer roads, these clusters were easier to locate than ever before. Pilots flying above the countryside could often see long lines of vehicles stretching along the narrow routes leading eastward. Whenever such columns were spotted, the aircraft descended once again toe-tack. Rockets struck the roads with powerful explosions, while bursts of cannon fire swept across the vehicles attempting to move through the corridor. Each new attack created fresh obstacles that slowed the retreat even further. A truck destroyed by rockets might ignite nearby fuel containers, sending flames across the road and forcing other vehicles to stop. A tank damaged by cannon fire might halt in the middle of the path, blocking the lane until soldiers could push it aside. These disruptions had a cumulative effect on the retreating forces. Even drivers who had managed to navigate around earlier wreckage now found themselves trapped behind new obstacles created during the latest airstrikes. German anti-aircraft gunners continued trying to defend the retreating columns from these attacks. Guns mounted on trucks and armored vehicles fired bursts of tracer ammunition toward the attacking aircraft. The glowing streaks of tracer fire rose into the sky in attempts to drive the Typhoon pilots away. Occasionally, these defensive efforts forced pilots to adjust their attack runs or climb away earlier than planned. But the overall balance of the battle remained unchanged. Allied aircraft continued returning to the corridor again and again, maintaining pressure on the retreating forces. Meanwhile, the Allied ground forces closing in from the north and south were now dangerously close to linking up. Soldiers moving along the roads inside the corridor could sometimes hear the distant sound of artillery fire from the approaching armies. For many of the retreating troops, this sound served as a reminder that time was rapidly running out. The race to escape the pocket had become a matter of hours rather than days. Some vehicles managed to pass through the narrowing gap and continue eastward beyond the reach of the advancing Allied forces. But many others remained trapped behind stalled convoys or wreckage created by the relentless air attacks. As the corridor grew smaller and the pressure from both ground and air forces increased, the final attempts to escape the pocket became more desperate. Drivers pushed their vehicles forward through narrow spaces between wreckage, while soldiers on foot moved quickly along the roads hoping to pass through the gap before it closed entirely. Above them, the Typhoon aircraft continued circling the battlefield, watching for any new movement along the escape routes. Their presence ensured that even during these last attempts to break free, the retreating German columns remained under constant threat from the sky, turning the final hours of the escape into a dramatic race against time. Chapter 8, Segment 1. The corridor collapses, the pocket closes. By the time the battle around the Falaise Pocket reached its final stage in late August 1944, the corridor through which German forces had been attempting to escape had narrowed to an extremely small gap. What had once been a wide region of countryside filled with retreating columns had now become a compressed battlefield where thousands of soldiers and vehicles struggled to pass through a shrinking opening between the advancing Allied armies. The effort to escape had become a race measured in hours rather than days, and every movement along the crowded roads carried the possibility that the path ahead might soon be blocked entirely. For the German forces still trapped inside the pocket, the closing of the corridor was becoming increasingly visible. The roads that led eastward were now filled with vehicles attempting to move through the final opening. Trucks loaded with supplies crept forward behind tanks and artillery tractors, while infantry soldiers marched beside them carrying what equipment they could manage during the retreat. The columns stretched for miles, but progress remained slow because of the wreckage left behind from days of air attacks. Burned-out trucks and abandoned vehicles continued to block sections of the road, forcing drivers to steer carefully around the obstacles or wait until soldiers cleared a path forward. Many drivers knew that every delay reduced their chances of escaping before the Allied forces closed the corridor completely. At the same time, reports from scouts and officers began confirming that Allied ground forces were approaching dangerously close from both sides. Canadian and Polish troops advancing from the north had already captured several key villages near the corridor, while American forces pushing northward from the south were steadily reducing the distance between the two Allied groups. These movements meant that the escape route was no longer a broad opening, but rather a narrow strip offland where vehicles attempted to pass through in a continuous stream. The pressure on the retreating columns increased with every passing hour. The situation was made even more difficult by the constant threat from the air. Typhoon squadrons and other Allied aircraft continued patrolling above the corridor, searching for the clusters of vehicles attempting to move through the final gap. Because the escape route had become so narrow, the retreating columns were now more concentrated than ever before. From the perspective of the pilots flying overhead, the roads below appeared crowded with vehicles struggling to move eastward through the remaining opening. These dense concentrations made the columns easy to locate and attack whenever aircraft arrived over the battlefield. When the Typhoon aircraft descended toward these crowded roads, the results could be devastating for the retreating forces. Rockets streaked downward into the tightly packed vehicles, followed by bursts of cannon fire that swept across the columns. Each explosion created new wreckage that blocked the already crowded roads. Drivers who had been slowly pushing their vehicles forward suddenly found themselves trapped behind burning trucks or damaged tanks. Some attempted to leave the road entirely and drive across nearby fields, but the ground often proved too soft to support heavy vehicles. When trucks or armored vehicles became stuck in the fields, they created additional obstacles that prevented other vehicles from following. For the soldiers inside the corridor, these attacks made the final stages of the retreat extremely dangerous. Drivers often had to choose between remaining with their vehicles or abandoning them temporarily while aircraft attacked overhead. Infantry soldiers ran toward ditches or hedgerows in attempts to find cover as rockets struck the roads nearby. When the aircraft departed, the columns attempted to resume movement, but the new wreckage often made progress even slower than before. German anti-aircraft gunners continued firing whenever aircraft appeared above the corridor. Guns mounted on trucks and armored vehicles sent streams of tracer ammunition into the sky in attempts to defend the retreating columns. The glowing lines of tracer fire sometimes forced pilots to alter their attack angles, but they rarely prevented the strikes entirely. The Allied aircraft remained numerous and persistent, returning again and again to attack the vehicles moving through the final escape route. Meanwhile, the Allied ground forces closing in from both sides were now dangerously close to linking up. Patrols from opposing Allied armies began encountering each other near the edges of the corridor. As these forces advanced, the gap through which the German columns attempted to escape became smaller and smaller. The soldiers inside the pocket could sometimes hear the sound of artillery fire from both directions, a reminder that the closing trap was nearly complete. Despite these overwhelming challenges, many German soldiers continued trying to move through the corridor as quickly as possible. Some vehicles managed to pass through the narrowing gap and escape to the east. Others abandoned their equipment entirely and continued the retreat on foot, hoping that speed might carry them through the opening before it disappeared. But with every passing hour the corridor grew smaller, and the combined pressure of advancing ground forces and relentless air attacks made the escape increasingly difficult. What had once been a retreat route now resembled a battlefield crowded with stalled convoys, burning vehicles, and soldiers racing against time. Above it all, the Typhoon aircraft continued circling the skies, ensuring that even in the final moments before the corridor closed, the retreating columns remained under constant attack from the air. Chapter 8, Segment 2. The Battlefield of Escape Chaos Inside the Pocket. As the escape corridor around the Falaise Pocket narrowed further, the situation inside the pocket grew increasingly chaotic. What had once been an organized military retreat had gradually transformed into a desperate struggle by thousands of soldiers and drivers trying to reach the last remaining opening before it disappeared completely. The roads that crossed the Normandy countryside were now filled with an overwhelming mixture of vehicles, equipment, and exhausted troops, all attempting to move eastward through the shrinking gap between the advancing Allied armies. For many German soldiers inside the pocket, the experience was unlike anything they had encountered earlier in the war. Units that had once fought together as organized formations were now scattered among other groups of soldiers and vehicles from different divisions. Trucks belonging to one unit might become trapped behind tanks from another, while infantry soldiers walked along the roads alongside drivers they had never met before. Officers attempted to restore order whenever possible, shouting instructions and directing vehicles toward whichever routes appeared least blocked by wreckage. But the conditions inside the corridor made such organization extremely difficult to maintain. One of the most visible signs of the growing chaos was the number of vehicles that had been abandoned during the retreat. Some trucks had been damaged during earlier air attacks and could no longer move forward. Others had run out of fuel or suffered mechanical failures after days of continuous movement. When this happened, drivers often had no choice but to leave the vehicle behind and continue the retreat on foot. These abandoned vehicles quickly became obstacles that slowed the movement of the convoys behind them. In many places, the roads were now lined with trucks and artillery pieces that had been pushed aside or left where they stopped. The fields surrounding the roads also began filling with vehicles that had attempted to escape the congestion by leaving the main routes. Drivers sometimes guided their trucks or armored vehicles across farmland in hopes of finding an alternate path eastward. But the soft ground of the fields often trapped heavy vehicles before they could travel far. When this happened, the vehicle remained stuck in the field, unable to move and often blocking the path for others attempting the same detour. As more vehicles became stranded in these areas, the countryside itself began to resemble an enormous traffic jam spread across both roads and fields. Above this chaotic landscape, Allied aircraft continued maintaining constant pressure on the retreating forces. Typhoon squadrons flew repeated missions over the corridor, scanning the roads and fields for signs of movement. From the perspective of the pilots, the battlefield below appeared filled with scattered groups of vehicles attempting to move in different directions. Smoke from earlier attacks drifted upward from damaged trucks and fuel vehicles, marking locations where convoys had already been struck. These smoke plumes often helped pilots identify areas where additional vehicles might still be trapped behind the wreckage. When Typhoon aircraft located new clusters of vehicles, they descended once again to attack. Rockets struck the roads and nearby fields, followed by bursts of cannon fire that damaged additional vehicles. Each new attack added to the growing destruction across the corridor. Trucks that had already been slowed by congestion were now struck by explosions that disabled engines or ignited fuel tanks. Tanks attempting to push through narrow passages between obstacles sometimes became immobilized after being hit by rockets or mechanical damage. The retreating soldiers experienced these attacks as sudden interruptions in an already desperate journey. Whenever the sound of aircraft engines grew louder, drivers attempted to steer their vehicles away from the roads or hide beneath trees and hedgerows. Infantry soldiers ran toward ditches or nearby buildings in hopes of avoiding the worst of the explosions. But with so many vehicles concentrated in such a small area, avoiding detection from the air was often impossible. German anti-aircraft units continued defending the convoys whenever aircraft approached. Guns mounted in trucks and armored vehicles fired bursts of tracer ammunition toward the attacking planes. The glowing lines of tracer fire filled the sky as gunners attempted to drive the aircraft away. In some cases, these defenses forced pilots to adjust their attack runs or climb away earlier than planned. But the constant rotation of Allied aircraft meant that the attacks rarely stopped completely. New aircraft often appeared shortly after earlier groups departed, continuing the assault on the retreating columns. Meanwhile, the pressure from Allied ground forces continued to increase. The armies advancing from the north and south were now very close to linking up across the corridor. Soldiers moving along the retreat routes could sometimes hear artillery fire from both directions, a reminder that the opening through which they hoped to escape was nearly gone. Despite this growing danger, many soldiers and drivers continued pushing forward, determined to pass through the corridor before it closed completely. Yet the chaos created by stalled vehicles, damaged equipment, and repeated air attacks made every mile of progress more difficult than the last. The corridor that once offered hope of escape had now become a crowded battlefield filled with abandoned vehicles, burning wreckage, and soldiers racing against time while aircraft continued circling above. Chapter 8, Segment 3. The Last Hours of the Corridor. As the final hours of the Falaise Pocket approached, the narrow escape corridor that had allowed German forces to withdraw eastward began shrinking to an almost unbelievable degree. What had once been a broad area of countryside had been compressed into a narrow and dangerous passage surrounded by advancing Allied armies. The soldiers attempting to escape through this opening were increasingly aware that time was running out. Every passing hour brought new reports that Allied troops were closing in from both the north and the south, and many officers realized that the corridor might soon disappear entirely. Inside the pocket, the roads were now almost continuously filled with vehicles moving in a slow and uneven stream. Trucks loaded with supplies crept forward behind tanks and armored vehicles, while artillery pieces were dragged along by tractors struggling to maneuver through the crowded routes. Infantry soldiers marched beside the columns, sometimes assisting drivers by pushing stalled vehicles or helping to clear small obstacles from the roads. Despite these efforts, the movement remained painfully slow. The wreckage left behind from earlier air attacks had created barriers that forced the columns to stop repeatedly, while soldiers attempted to open new paths forward. Burned trucks and shattered armored vehicles remained scattered across the countryside, many of them still smoldering from explosions that had occurred only hours earlier. For the drivers attempting to guide their vehicles through the corridor, the challenge was enormous. They had to navigate narrow roads already packed with traffic while avoiding the damaged vehicles that blocked their path. In some areas, the congestion was so severe that drivers abandoned the roads entirely and attempted to cross the nearby fields in hopes of bypassing the obstacles. But these detours often led to new problems. The farmland of Normandy, churned by weeks of battle and summer rains, could easily trap heavy vehicles in the soft earth. Once a truck or armored vehicle became stuck in a field, it often remained there permanently, adding yet another obstacle for those attempting to follow behind. The sense of urgency among the retreating soldiers grew stronger with each mile they traveled. Officers moving along the roads shouted instructions and urged drivers to maintain movement whenever possible. Some units attempted to organize the retreat by directing vehicles into columns and assigning routes through the corridor. But such organization was difficult to maintain amid the confusion created by constant air attacks and the mixture of units from different divisions all attempting to escape at the same time. While the retreat continued on the ground, the skies above the corridor remained filled with Allied aircraft searching for targets. The Typhoon squadrons that had been attacking the German columns throughout the battle continued flying missions over the pocket during these final hours from the air. The pilots could easily see the long lines of vehicles moving slowly across the countryside. Dust clouds rose from the roads as convoys advanced, marking the routes taken by retreating columns and making them visible from miles away. When Typhoon aircraft approached these areas, they began their attacks with the same deadly precision that had already destroyed hundreds of vehicles during the previous days of the battle. Rockets streaked downward toward the roads, striking trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces that had nowhere to hide. The explosions created new wreckage that blocked the already crowded escape routes. Following the rockets came bursts of cannon fire that swept across the columns, damaging additional vehicles and forcing soldiers to scatter in search of cover. For the soldiers on the ground, these attacks were terrifying interruptions in an already desperate retreat. Drivers sometimes abandoned their vehicles the moment they heard the roar of aircraft engines overhead. Infantry soldiers ran toward ditches, hedgerows, or the remains of damaged buildings, hoping that these small pieces of cover might protect them from the explosions. Yet, with so many vehicles crowded together inside the narrow corridor, it was often impossible to avoid the effects of the attacks completely. Even those who escaped direct hits often found themselves trapped behind burning wreckage that blocked the road ahead. German anti-aircraft gunners did everything they could to defend the retreating columns. Guns mounted on trucks and armored vehicles fired streams of tracer ammunition into the sky whenever aircraft appeared overhead. The bright lines of tracer fire arched upward as the gunners attempted to force the aircraft away from their targets. In some cases, the defensive fire caused the pilots to change their attack paths or pull away earlier than planned. But the Allied aircraft continued returning again and again, maintaining constant pressure on the retreating forces. Meanwhile, the Allied ground armies continued closing the corridor from both sides. Canadian and Polish troops advancing from the north captured positions overlooking the escape route, while American forces moving northward reduced the remaining distance from the south. As these armies approached each other, the gap between them became dangerously small. The soldiers inside the pocket could now hear the sound of gunfire and artillery from both directions, confirming that the closing trap was almost complete. Yet even as the corridor shrank to its final size, thousands of soldiers continued attempting to pass through it. Some vehicles managed to escape eastward, slipping through the narrowing gap just before Allied troops reached the same ground. Others abandoned their equipment entirely and continued the retreat on foot, hoping that speed and determination might carry them through before the route disappeared. The landscape of the corridor became a chaotic mixture of burning wreckage, stalled vehicles, and exhausted soldiers moving through fields and roads in a final effort to escape. Above it all, the Typhoon aircraft continued circling the skies, ensuring that the retreating columns remained under constant threat even during the last desperate hours before the corridor finally closed. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The corridor closes, the trap seals at Falaise. By the final days of the battle in August 1944, the once wide escape route from the Falaise Pocket had been reduced to a dangerously narrow corridor of countryside. The retreating German forces had been attempting for days to push thousands of vehicles and soldiers through this opening, hoping to escape the tightening grip of the Allied armies surrounding them. But now the corridor itself had become the center of the battlefield. Every mile of road, every field, and every small village along the route was filled with columns of retreating troops struggling to move eastward before the trap finally closed. Inside the pocket, the scale of the retreat had become overwhelming. Entire divisions that had once fought across Normandy were now attempting to withdraw through the same narrow passage at the same time. Trucks loaded with supplies crept forward along crowded roads while tanks and armored vehicles tried to maintain order within the columns. Infantry soldiers marched beside the vehicles or walked across nearby fields to avoid the congestion. Many had already been marching and fighting for days without rest. Dust rose from the roads as the endless line of vehicles attempted to advance through the corridor. From a distance, the movement looked like a long river of metal and men slowly flowing eastward through the countryside. But the closer one looked, the more obvious the problems became. Burned trucks and shattered armored vehicles were scattered along the roads, the result of earlier air attacks that had struck the retreating columns again and again. Some wrecked vehicles had been pushed aside by soldiers trying to clear a path. Others remained where they had been destroyed, forcing drivers to carefully guide their vehicles around the obstacles. The congestion created constant delays, and every delay increased the danger that Allied forces might reach the corridor before the retreat could be completed. Many officers understood the seriousness of the situation. Messengers moved through the columns carrying orders that urged soldiers to keep moving eastward as quickly as possible. Some commanders attempted to organize traffic by directing certain units along specific routes. But the mixture of damaged roads, abandoned vehicles, and continuous air attacks made such organization extremely difficult. What had once been a structured military withdrawal now looked more like a desperate escape. While this chaotic movement unfolded on the ground, Allied aircraft continued dominating the skies above the pocket. The Typhoon fighter bombers that had been attacking the retreating German forces throughout the battle remained a constant presence over the corridor. From high above the countryside, pilots could see the long lines of vehicles moving slowly along the roads and across the fields. The concentration of vehicles inside the narrow escape route made them easy to locate from the air. Dust clouds rising from the columns often revealed their position long before the aircraft reached the area. When Typhoon squadrons approached the corridor, the pilots prepared their attacks with the efficiency that had become routine during the battle. Rockets were launched toward the crowded roads below, striking trucks and armored vehicles that had little room to maneuver. The explosions created new obstacles across the routes, turning previously passable roads into blocked passages filled with burning wreckage. Following the rocket attacks came bursts of cannon fire that swept across the columns, damaging additional vehicles and scattering the soldiers who had been marching beside them. For the soldiers trapped inside the pocket, the sound of approaching aircraft had become one of the most feared signals of danger. Drivers often tried to steer their vehicles away from the roads and into nearby fields whenever aircraft appeared overhead. Infantry soldiers rushed toward ditches, hedgerows, or small farm buildings in hopes of finding some protection from the explosions. But with thousands of vehicles concentrated in such a small area, avoiding detection was nearly impossible. Even when soldiers managed to hide temporarily, the burning wreckage left behind by earlier attacks continued blocking the routes they needed to travel. German anti-aircraft crews fought back as best they could. Guns mounted on trucks and armored vehicles fired bursts of tracer ammunition toward the attacking planes. The sky above the corridor, sometimes filled with glowing lines of tracer fire as the gunners attempted to drive the aircraft away. Occasionally, the defensive fire force pilots towed just their attack paths or climb away earlier than planned. Yet the air attacks continued regardless. Allied aircraft returned again and again, maintaining relentless pressure on the retreating forces. Meanwhile, the Allied ground armies continued closing in on the corridor itself. Canadian and Polish troops advancing from the north captured high ground overlooking the escape route, allowing them to observe the retreating columns moving through the valley below. From the south, American forces pushed steadily northward, reducing the distance between the two Allied groups. As these forces advanced, the gap through which the German soldiers hoped to escape grew smaller and smaller. Inside the pocket, the soldiers could sometimes hear artillery fire from both directions, a constant reminder that the trap was nearly complete. Yet despite the danger, the retreat continued. Trucks and tanks kept moving eastward, sometimes advancing only a few hundred meters at a time before stopping again behind another obstacle. Infantry soldiers continued marching beside the columns or slipping through the fields in hopes of reaching the corridor before it vanished entirely. But as the hours passed and the Allied armies drew closer together, it became increasingly clear that the window of escape was closing. The battlefield that had once been an escape route was now turning into a graveyard of destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment, marking the final moments before the Falaise Pocket finally sealed shut. Chapter 9, Segment 2. The Valley of Destruction After the Air Attacks. As the escape corridor at the Falaise Pocket continued shrinking during the final days of the battle, the landscape within the pocket began to change dramatically. What had once been ordinary farmland dotted with villages and hedgerows had been transformed into a battlefield marked by destruction on an enormous scale. The repeated air attacks carried out by Allied aircraft, especially the Typhoon squadrons, had left behind a vast trail of damaged and destroyed vehicles scattered across the countryside. For soldiers moving through the corridor, the road ahead increasingly resembled a graveyard of military equipment rather than a functioning route of retreat. Burned trucks stood at strange angles along the roadsides, their frames blackened by fire. Some vehicles had exploded during earlier attacks, leaving only twisted metal and shattered parts behind. Tanks and armored vehicles that had been struck by rockets sometimes remained in the middle of the road where they had stopped, forcing other drivers to steer carefully around them. In some places, the wreckage had piled up so densely that soldiers were forced to abandon the road entirely and attempt to cross the nearby fields. These fields, once used for farming, had also become littered with abandoned vehicles and scattered equipment. Crates of ammunition, fuel containers, and personal belongings lay scattered across the ground where soldiers had dropped them during hurried attempts to escape air attacks. The smell of smoke and burned fuel hung heavily in the air in many areas of the pocket, drifting from the vehicles that continued smoldering long after the explosions had ended. For the soldiers moving through this devastated landscape, the destruction created constant obstacles. Drivers had to guide their vehicles slowly through narrow gaps between wrecked trucks and armored vehicles. Infantry soldiers sometimes climbed over the damaged equipment while attempting to keep pace with the retreating columns. The delays caused by this wreckage made the retreat even more dangerous, because every moment spent navigating the destroyed vehicles allowed the Allied forces closing the corridor more time to advance. Some soldiers began abandoning their vehicles entirely when progress became impossible. Drivers whose trucks had become trapped behind wreckage often left them behind and continued the retreat on foot. Others attempted to push damaged vehicles aside using whatever manpower was available, but the weight of armored vehicles made such efforts extremely difficult. As more vehicles were abandoned, the congestion along the roads grew even worse. Above this devastated landscape, Allied aircraft continued appearing at regular intervals. The Typhoon fighter bombers that had already inflicted enormous damage during the earlier phases of the battle remained active over the pocket as the retreat continued. Pilots flying these aircraft often described seeing an extraordinary concentration of vehicles below them. From the air, the roads leading eastward were filled with convoys stretching across miles of countryside. Smoke from earlier attacks often rose into the sky in thin gray columns, marking the places where vehicles had already been destroyed. These smoke plumes frequently guided pilots toward new targets, since surviving vehicles were often trapped behind the wreckage left by earlier strikes. When the Typhoon aircraft descended toward these columns, the attacks followed the same deadly pattern that had been repeated throughout the battle. Rockets streaked downward toward the crowded roads and fields, striking trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces that were unable to move quickly enough to escape. The explosions sent debris into the air and created new fires that spread across the damaged vehicles. Following the rocket strikes came bursts of cannon fire from the aircraft's powerful guns. These shells tore through trucks and lightly armored vehicles, adding further destruction to the already chaotic scene below. For the soldiers inside the pocket, the arrival of aircraft meant another sudden interruption in their struggle to escape. Drivers often attempted to steer their vehicles off the roads into the fields whenever they heard aircraft approaching. Infantry soldiers ran toward hedgerows or shallow ditches in hopes of avoiding the worst of the explosions. But the sheer number of vehicles concentrated within the corridor made it difficult for anyone to escape the danger entirely. Even those who avoided direct hits frequently found themselves trapped behind burning wreckage that blocked their path forward. German anti-aircraft units continued fighting back during these attacks. Guns mounted on trucks, armored vehicles, and improvised positions fired streams of tracer ammunition toward the aircraft overhead. The bright streaks of tracer fire climbed into the sky as the gunners attempted to force the attacking planes away. Occasionally, these defenses succeeded in damaging or driving off individual aircraft, but they could not stop the continuous waves of attacks carried out by Allied squadrons operating over the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Allied ground forces closing in from both directions continued advancing toward the corridor. Canadian and Polish troops approaching from the north captured positions that overlooked the valley through which the retreating German columns were attempting to escape. From these heights, they could observe the destruction below and sometimes direct artillery fire toward the congested roads. At the same time, American forces moving northward reduced the remaining distance between the two Allied armies. For the soldiers still trapped inside the pocket, the realization gradually spread that the opportunity to escape was disappearing. Yet despite the destruction surrounding them, thousands of soldiers continued pressing forward. Some vehicles managed to pass through the corridor and reach safety beyond the closing trap. Others abandoned their equipment and continued moving eastward on foot, determined to escape even if it meant leaving everything behind. But the devastated landscape left behind by the air attacks made every step of that journey more difficult. The once peaceful fields and roads of Normandy had become a vast battlefield filled with wreckage, smoke, and scattered equipment. An unmistakable sign that the Battle of the Falaise Pocket was reaching its final and most destructive moments. Chapter 9, Segment 3. The closing of the trap, the end of the Falaise Pocket. By the final stage of the battle around the Falaise Pocket, the escape corridor had become so narrow that many soldiers inside the pocket began to realize that the opportunity to escape might vanish at any moment. For days, the German forces had been attempting to push their vehicles and troops eastward through the shrinking opening between the advancing Allied armies. Now that opening had become little more than a narrow strip of countryside surrounded on nearly every side by Allied troops. The pressure inside the pocket was enormous. Thousands of soldiers were still trying to move through the corridor, and every road leading toward the gap remained crowded with trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, and infantry units attempting to escape before it was too late. The movement of these columns continued day and night. Drivers pushed their vehicles forward slowly through the wreckage left behind from earlier air attacks. Infantry soldiers marched beside them or cut across nearby fields to bypass blocked sections of road. Officers shouted instructions and tried to keep the columns moving, but the mixture of units from many different divisions made coordination extremely difficult. Some soldiers had already been marching for days with little rest. Their uniforms were dusty from the constant movement across the countryside, and many carried only the equipment they could manage during the retreat. Around them, the landscape told the story of the battle that had taken place during the previous days. Burned trucks and shattered armored vehicles lined the roads. Artillery pieces stood abandoned in fields where their crews had been forced to leave them behind. In some places, the wreckage had accumulated so heavily that the road ahead looked almost completely blocked. When this happened, soldiers sometimes climbed over the damaged vehicles or tried to push smaller wreckage aside to create a narrow passage for the remaining vehicles. Despite these obstacles, many soldiers still believed that reaching the corridor in time might allow them to escape. The determination to keep moving eastward remained strong. Yet the sound of artillery fire echoing across the countryside reminded everyone that the Allied armies were closing in from both directions. Each explosion in the distance suggested that the gap between the Allied forces was becoming smaller with every passing hour. While the retreat continued on the ground, the skies above the pocket remained filled with Allied aircraft. The Typhoon fighter bombers that had been attacking the German columns throughout the battle continued flying missions over the corridor during these final hours. For the pilots, the battlefield below offered an unmistakable view of the destruction that had already taken place. Long lines of damaged vehicles stretched across the roads and fields, many of them still smoldering from earlier attacks. Yet, even amid this devastation, large numbers of vehicles continued moving eastward through the narrow opening. Whenever the Typhoon aircraft located these columns, they prepared for another attack. Rockets streaked downward toward the crowded vehicles below, striking trucks and armored vehicles that were unable to escape quickly enough. The explosions created new fires that spread through fuel tanks and ammunition carried by the convoys. Following the rocket strikes came bursts of cannon fire that tore through lightly armored vehicles and trucks. Each new attack added more wreckage to the already crowded roads, making the retreat even more difficult for those still trying to escape. For the soldiers on the ground, the sudden roar of aircraft engines often meant that another wave of destruction was about to begin. Drivers sometimes abandoned their vehicles when they heard the aircraft approaching, running toward nearby hedgerows or ditches in hopes of finding cover. Infantry soldiers scattered across the fields, pressing themselves against the ground while the rockets and cannon fire struck the roads nearby. When the aircraft finally departed, the survivors returned to the roads and attempted to continue their journey eastward. But the new wreckage left behind by each attack often blocked the path ahead, forcing the columns to stop once again while soldiers attempted to clear a narrow route forward. German anti-aircraft gunners continued defending the retreating forces whenever aircraft appeared overhead. Guns mounted on trucks and armored vehicles fired bursts of tracer ammunition into the sky, the glowing streaks rising upward in an attempt to drive the attacking planes away. Occasionally, these defenses forced pilots to adjust their attack angles or break off an approach earlier than planned. But the Allied aircraft remained numerous, and new squadrons frequently appeared after earlier ones departed. The constant presence of aircraft ensured that the retreating columns remained under continuous pressure from the air. Meanwhile, the Allied ground armies continued advancing toward each other across the corridor. Canadian and Polish forces approaching from the north captured high ground that overlooked the valley through which the German columns were attempting to escape. From these positions, they could observe the movement of vehicles below and sometimes direct artillery fire toward the congested roads. At the same time, American forces advancing from the south moved steadily closer to the same area. The distance between the two Allied groups grew smaller with every hour. Eventually, the moment arrived when the advancing forces from the north and south finally linked up, closing the corridor that had allowed the German forces to escape. The trap that had been tightening for days was now sealed. For many soldiers still inside the pocket, the closing of the corridor meant that escape was no longer possible. Some attempted to slip through small gaps in the surrounding lines under cover of darkness, while others surrendered to the advancing Allied troops. The fields and roads that had once served as the retreat route now lay silent beneath the smoke drifting from hundreds of destroyed vehicles. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket had reached its conclusion, leaving behind one of the most dramatic scenes of destruction seen during the campaign in Normandy. Chapter 10, Segment 1. After the storm, the battlefield revealed. When the fighting around the Falaise Pocket finally came to an end in late August 1944, the countryside of Normandy revealed a battlefield unlike anything many soldiers had seen before. The long days of air attacks, artillery fire, and desperate retreat had left behind a vast landscape filled with the remains of one of the most dramatic encirclements of the Second World War. The fields, roads, and villages that had once been ordinary parts of rural France were now scattered with the wreckage of thousands of vehicles and abandoned equipment. As Allied troops advanced into the area after the corridor had closed, they began to see the full scale of the destruction that had taken place during the final days of the battle. Along the roads leading out of the pocket stood long rows of burned trucks and shattered armored vehicles. Some had been destroyed by rockets fired from the Typhoon aircraft that had dominated the skies during the battle. Others had been damaged by artillery or abandoned during the chaotic retreat when their crews realized they could no longer escape. Many vehicles had been pushed aside by soldiers attempting to clear a path during the retreat, leaving them scattered across the roadsides and fields in irregular lines. In some places, the wreckage was so dense that the road itself was almost completely hidden beneath the destroyed equipment. Allied soldiers who moved through these areas often described the battlefield as a massive graveyard of military machinery. Tanks stood silent where they had been struck by rockets, their armor blackened by fire. Trucks loaded with supplies remained exactly where they had stopped, their cargo scattered across the ground after explosions had torn through them. Artillery pieces stood abandoned beside the roads, their crews long gone after the retreat collapsed. For the Allied soldiers advancing through the pocket, the sight was both impressive and sobering. The destruction demonstrated the scale of the battle that had taken place during the previous days. It also showed how difficult the German retreat had become once the Allied air forces and ground armies had begun working together to close the trap. The pocket that had once contained tens of thousands of retreating soldiers was now filled with the evidence of their struggle to escape. Above this devastated battlefield, the skies that had once been filled with the roar of aircraft were now quiet. During the battle, Typhoon fighter bombers had flown countless missions over the pocket, attacking the German columns whenever they appeared on the roads or fields below. Their rockets and cannon fire had destroyed hundreds of vehicles, creating the wreckage that now covered much of the countryside. For the pilots who had flown those missions, the results of their attacks became clear only after the fighting ended. Reconnaissance aircraft that flew over the pocket during the days following the battle photographed the enormous fields of destroyed equipment. These images revealed long lines of burned vehicles stretching across miles off countryside. In some places, entire convoys had been halted by a single successful rocket attack that blocked the road and trapped the vehicles behind it. When later aircraft returned to attack those trapped columns, the result had been a chain reaction of destruction that left dozens of vehicles destroyed in the same location. On the ground, Allied soldiers walking through the battlefield often found evidence of how desperate the retreat had become. Personal equipment lay scattered beside the roads where soldiers had abandoned it in their rush to escape. Fuel containers, ammunition crates, and spare vehicle parts were spread across the fields where convoys had been forced to leave them behind. Some vehicles still carried supplies intended for units that would never receive them. Maps, helmets, and small personal belongings remained where they had been dropped during the final moments of the retreat. Engineers and recovery units eventually began the enormous task of clearing the roads. The wreckage blocking the escape routes had to be removed before normal traffic could pass through the area again. Bulldozers and recovery vehicles worked slowly along the roads, pushing burned trucks and armored vehicles aside so that the routes could be reopened. In many places this work took days, because the sheer number of destroyed vehicles made progress slow and difficult. Yet, even as the cleanup began, the significance of the battle was already becoming clear to the soldiers who had fought there. The destruction inside the pocket showed how powerful the combination of air power and ground forces had become during the Normandy campaign. The Typhoon aircraft that had attacked the retreating German columns had played a major role in turning the escape corridor into a battlefield filled with wreckage. Their attacks had slowed the retreat, blocked the roads, and forced the German forces into a position where the Allied armies could close the trap. The battle off the Falaise Pocket had therefore become more than just another victory on the Western Front. It was a demonstration of how modern warfare had changed, showing the devastating effect that coordinated air and ground operations could have on an army attempting to retreat. And as the smoke slowly faded from the fields of Normandy, the wreckage scattered across the countryside remained as silent proof of how decisive those final days of the battle had been. Chapter 10, Segment 2. The Strategic Consequences: What the Battle Changed. When the fighting around the Falaise Pocket finally ended and the corridor closed completely, the immediate destruction on the battlefield was only part of the story. The consequences of the battle reached far beyond the wreckage scattered across the countryside of Normandy. Military commanders on both sides quickly realized that the events inside the pocket had dramatically changed the situation on the Western Front. For the German forces, the loss of so many vehicles, weapons, and experienced soldiers during the retreat meant that the defensive strength of their armies in France had been severely weakened. During the weeks following the battle, Allied units advancing through the region began to assess just how large the defeat had been. Thousands of German soldiers had been captured during the closing of the pocket, while many others had been killed or wounded during the desperate attempts to escape. But the destruction of equipment may have been even more damaging. The burned and abandoned vehicles scattered across the battlefield represented the loss of transport, artillery, and armored strength that would have been extremely difficult for the German army to replace quickly. The retreating forces that had managed to escape through the corridor often did so without much of their heavy equipment. Many soldiers reached safety east of the pocket carrying only their personal weapons and whatever supplies they had managed to keep during the chaotic withdrawal. Tanks and trucks that had once supported these units were left behind, either destroyed by air attacks or abandoned when the retreat routes became blocked. As a result, the German formations that regrouped after the battle were often incomplete and poorly equipped compared to the divisions that had originally fought in Normandy. Allied commanders understood that this moment created a rare opportunity. The destruction inside the pocket meant that the German defensive lines in France were now dangerously weakened. With large numbers of vehicles destroyed and supply systems disrupted, it would be far more difficult for the German army to slow the Allied advance across the country. The roads leading east from Normandy, once filled with retreating columns, were now open for the advancing Allied forces to use in their own movement toward the interior of France. The battle also highlighted the growing importance of air power in modern warfare. Throughout the fighting around the Falaise Pocket, Allied aircraft had played a decisive role in shaping the outcome of the battle. The Typhoon fighter bombers that had attacked the retreating German columns had demonstrated how effective close air support could be when coordinated with advancing ground forces. By repeatedly striking the roads used by the retreating vehicles, the aircraft had slowed the German withdrawal and turned the escape corridor into a dangerous battlefield. Every rocket attack that destroyed a truck or tank had the potential to block the road behind it, trapping additional vehicles and creating new targets for later attacks. This chain reaction of destruction made it extremely difficult for the retreating forces to maintain any kind of organized movement. Military observers studying the battle after it ended noted that the combination of air attacks and advancing ground forces had created a situation where the retreating army could not easily escape. The aircraft forced the convoys to move slowly and carefully, while the ground troops closed the corridor from both sides. Together, these pressures transformed what might have been a controlled withdrawal into a chaotic race for survival. For the Allied air forces, the battle became an example of how fighter bombers could influence the outcome of large-scale ground operations. The Typhoon aircraft had been specifically designed Tokhari rockets and heavy cannons capable of damaging armored vehicles. During the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, those weapons proved extremely effective against columns of vehicles moving along exposed roads. Pilots often described how they could see the long lines of trucks and tanks from miles away, their movement revealed by dust rising from the roads below. Once the aircraft arrived over the battlefield, they could strike those columns with remarkable speed. Yet even as the success of the air attacks became clear, Allied commanders also recognized that victory had required coordination between many different forces. The aircraft alone could not have closed the pocket without the steady advance of the ground armies approaching from the north and south. Canadian, Polish, and American forces had all contributed to the final closing of the corridor, moving forward through difficult terrain while the air forces attacked the retreating columns ahead of them. Together, these operations demonstrated how cooperation between air and ground units could produce results that neither force might have achieved alone. By the time the smoke cleared from the fields of Normandy, the Battle of the Falaise Pocket had become one of the most important turning points of the campaign in Western Europe. The destruction inside the pocket weakened the German army's ability to defend France and open the way for the Allied advance toward the German border. The burned vehicles scattered across the battlefield were more than just the remains of a retreat. They were a sign that the balance of power on the Western Front had shifted decisively. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Legacy of the Battle, the End of the Normandy Campaign. When historians later looked back at the events surrounding the Falaise Pocket, many of them described it as one of the most decisive moments of the entire Normandy campaign. The weeks of fighting that followed the Allied landings in June 1944 had gradually pushed the German armies west of Paris into an increasingly difficult position. But it was the closing of the pocket in August that finally broke the defensive structure that had been holding the front together. The destruction that occurred during those final days did not simply mark the end of a single battle. It marked the collapse of the German position in Normandy and opened the road for the Allied armies to advance rapidly across France. After the pocket closed, the surviving German forces were forced to retreat quickly toward the east. The units that managed to escape did so in a weakened condition. Many had lost their vehicles, their artillery, and much of their equipment during the chaotic withdrawal through the corridor. Soldiers who reached the German defensive lines further east often arrived exhausted after days of continuous movement and combat. They had escaped the trap, but the divisions they belonged to were no longer the same powerful formations that had fought earlier in the campaign. For the Allied armies, the situation was very different. With the German forces in Normandy severely damaged, the Allied advance began accelerating across northern France. Columns of Allied vehicles moved along the same roads that had recently been filled with retreating German convoys. Engineers repaired damaged bridges and cleared the wreckage that still blocked many of the routes. As these obstacles were removed, the Allied armies were able to push forward quickly toward major cities and transportation centers further inland. The collapse of the German front also meant that the strategic initiative had firmly shifted to the Allied side. Instead of defending against German counterattacks, Allied commanders were now planning how to maintain the momentum of their advance. Supply lines were extended, new offensives were prepared, and the armies that had fought in Normandy began moving toward the borders of Germany itself. The victory at the Falaise Pocket, therefore, became more than just a battlefield success. It became a turning point that changed the direction of the campaign in Western Europe. Even years after the war ended, the battlefield of the Falaise Pocket remained one of the most striking examples of destruction caused by modern warfare. The fields and roads where the retreat had taken place were slowly cleared and restored, but the memory of what had happened there remained vivid for the soldiers who had witnessed it. Veterans who later returned to the region often described how the landscape had once been filled with burned vehicles and abandoned equipment. The wreckage left behind after the battle had stretched across miles of countryside, marking the path of the retreat and the places where air attacks had struck the convoys. Many accounts from Allied soldiers also highlighted the role played by the Typhoon aircraft during those final days. The repeated attacks carried out by these fighter bombers had slowed the retreat and created the wreckage that blocked the escape routes. By striking the columns again and again, the aircraft helped transform the corridor into a battlefield where vehicles were destroyed faster than they could be moved. For the soldiers on the ground, the sound of Typhoon engines overhead had become a familiar sign that another attack was about to begin. Military historians studying the battle often point to this cooperation between air power and ground forces as one of the key reasons for the Allied success. The aircraft forced the retreating columns to slow down and scatter, while the advancing armies closed the corridor from both sides. Without this combination of pressure from the air and the ground, the German forces might have escaped in much larger numbers. Instead, the pocket became a decisive trap that destroyed a large portion of the German army in Normandy. The battle also served as a reminder of how quickly the fortunes of war could change. Only weeks earlier, the German forces in Normandy had still hoped to contain the Allied invasion and prevent a breakout from the beaches. But once the Allied armies broke through those defensive lines and began pushing inland, the situation changed rapidly. The retreat toward the Falaise Pocket was the result of that sudden shift in momentum. When the pocket finally closed, it symbolized the end of the German attempt to hold Normandy. From that point forward, the war in Western Europe entered a new phase. The Allied armies would continue advancing across France, liberating cities and pushing toward the borders of Germany. Yet the story of the Falaise Pocket remained one of the most dramatic chapters of that campaign. The wreckage left behind in the fields of Normandy stood as a powerful reminder of how decisive those final days had been. The destruction of hundreds of vehicles, the desperate attempts to escape, and the relentless attacks from the air had all combined to create one of the most significant defeats suffered by the German army in the West. And in the quiet countryside where the battle had once raged, the memory of those events continued to echo long after the fighting had ended. As the smoke slowly cleared over the fields of Normandy, the Battle of the Falaise Pocket left behind more than just wrecked vehicles and silent roads. It marked the moment when the German army in France lost its ability to stop the Allied advance. The destruction inside the pocket, columns shattered by air attacks, escape routes closed by advancing armies, and thousands of soldiers forced into a desperate retreat, became one of the defining turning points of the Western Front in 1944. What happened in those few days reshaped the course of the war in Western Europe, opening the road for the liberation of France and the long push toward Germany itself. History often remembers the great battles by their names, but behind those names are countless moments. Pilots searching the roads from the sky, soldiers marching through smoke-filled valleys, commanders racing against time as the trap slowly closed. The story of the Falaise Pocket is one of those moments, where strategy, air power, and determination came together to change the outcome of a campaign. If you found this story fascinating and want to explore more untold stories from World War II and history's most dramatic moments, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next deep dive into the past.